covered in gift baskets and flowers. Teresa's mother and Cheryl made quiet small talk as Teresa sat silently, her eyes intently focused on her cell phone, which sat like a dumb blank slate on the table in front of her. 12:03 came and went without a call. Teresa chuckled mirthlessly to herself. She had intentionally made sure she was not alone for today's phone call from Ray. If he did call again, this time she wanted witnesses, but part of her knew that he would not call her if she was not alone.
Is everything okay, Reese?
Cheryl asked. Teresa peeled her eyes away from the silent phone.
Yes.
She whispered and sipped her tea. I flew in from across country for Ray's viewing and funeral. Teresa's mother and I were cordial towards each other, but also avoided each other as much as possible for Teresa's sake. I was shocked at how she looked, tired and haggard and grief-stricken of course, but also troubled in a way that did not look like simple mourning. I held her tightly several times over the course of those 2 days, always at a loss for words, wishing there was anything in the world I could do to remove the weight of sorrow pressing on her shoulders. Teresa told me later that she had tucked her phone away during those 2 days of activities. She had thought that maybe going through the ceremony of remembering Ray's life, seeing his serene face as he lay dead in his casket, and then watching with surprising detachment as his body was lowered into the ground would bring a final end to his daily calls. But on Monday, alone at home for only the second time in the week since Ray had died, her phone rang again. She considered not answering it, but could not resist doing so, a sense of both longing and hopelessness in her chest.
Ray?
She said.
Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?
Ray said, and Teresa burst into tears. For the next several days, Teresa lived in a fog. She always took Ray's call. Some days she let the conversation play out like it had on the first day, relishing in those first fleeting seconds when Ray was still happy and alive. Other days she interrupted his joke in order to ask him a question, like where he had put the key to the safety deposit box or where he had filed insurance papers. Confused but cooperative, Ray always answered her questions. Some days she used those initial seconds to convey her deep love for him, and she sobbed as he had expressed his love for her in return. But then, all too quickly, the sound of a gun would bring their conversation to an abrupt end. And then, one day, weeks on, the phone had rung and Teresa had said,
"Hello, baby,"
and waited for Ray to launch into his bicycle joke. There was a pause, and Ray had said,
Reese, did I call you earlier today?
A coldness spread through Teresa's chest that she couldn't understand.
"What? No, you didn't."
It's so strange.
Ray said.
I picked up the phone to call you and got this sudden sense of deja vu, like I already called you today.
A tear fell silently down Teresa's cheek. She couldn't find words.
Is everything okay?
Ray asked.
"I miss you, baby."
Ray chuckled.
I miss you too.
He responded, more of a question than a statement.
I'll see you in a few hours.
"No, you won't,"
she said.
Reese, what?
And then he stopped.
Did you hear that?
Teresa hung up the phone. Her thoughts stirred with confusion and an odd sense of hope. Every prior conversation had been laden with a heavy sense of the inevitable. No matter what Teresa said to him, Ray would always end up dead on the floor of his office bathroom. But today he had seemed to remember something. And their conversation had taken a different course at Ray's direction. And Teresa began to wonder what would happen if she tried pushing harder, made more of an effort to get Ray to take a different course of action. The next day when Ray called, Teresa immediately took charge of the conversation.
"Ray, I need you to listen to me carefully and answer me as fast as you can. How many different ways are there out of your office? Out of your department, I mean."
What?
"Answer me!"
There's the main door, straight through goes to the IT department, and to the left takes me down to the main hallway. There's a second door that goes through HR, but it just meets up at the main hallway at the other end. And there's the door to the balcony. Why are you asking me this?
Grab your keys. Don't grab anything else. Go through the IT department. Do not go down the hall. Get to your car and come home. Now.
There was a pause, and then Ray said,
Okay, I'm coming.
and the line went dead. Teresa found herself out of breath while she waited. She paced. Moments later, her phone rang again.
Reese, listen to me. There's a man with a gun.
Teresa screamed in frustration and threw her phone across the room, where it hit the carpet and slid across the floor. The next time he called, Teresa asked,
Ray, the balcony outside your department, does it have steps that go down to the courtyard?
Yeah? Why do you ask?
And you can get to the parking lot from there.
Yes? What's going on?
Go. Don't ask me anything. Just go out the balcony doors and to your car. Do it now. Come home.
Teresa insisted.
Is everything okay?
Go!
A minute passed, then two. Teresa barely breathed as she stared at her phone. 5 minutes passed without a call from Ray. She was finally able to take a breath. Teresa was on her bed. Her back ached as she sat arched over her phone. For the first time since the day he died, there was no second phone call, and Teresa had no idea what to expect next. She was lost in a nearly thoughtless daze when she heard the front door open. She jumped and nearly cried out. The door closed and she heard footsteps. She jumped from the bed, racing from the bedroom and down the hallway to the foyer. And impossibly, there he was. His tall, gangly, goofy-looking yet handsome self, although his skin was deathly pale to the point of almost being blue. He smiled at her, although his brow was furrowed in concern. His mouth formed the beginnings of a question, but she ran to him and leapt into his arms. He was cold, deathly cold, and Teresa gasped. "Is everything okay?" he asked. His voice sounded like it did on mornings when he had first woken up, rattling and unused.
Everything's okay now.
Teresa said, weeping into his shoulder, holding him tighter than she ever had before. And in return, Ray held her tightly as well, but his hands were like ice on her back, his body stiff against hers, and although her ear was pressed firmly against his chest, she could not feel his heart beating, a fact that she dismissed just as quickly as she realized it. Teresa decided to tell him everything. Sitting at the kitchen table, she held his icy hand in both of hers as she recounted everything from the initial shooting at Ray's office, his death, his funeral, and his daily phone calls. He stared at her blankly, his face registering no alarm, confusion, or even recollection as she spoke. She sat back in her chair and considered him for a moment.
Tabula rasa.
She thought dully as she looked at him. He wasn't hungry, he wasn't thirsty. He was content to sit quietly until Teresa gave him directions to move. Her heart ached with the dueling emotions of relief and terrible confusion, and she watched him closely, unable to hide the obvious bewilderment on her face. And yet, Ray never asked her what was wrong. That evening, Teresa led Ray to their bedroom, where he stood dully by the foot of the bed and looked at her as if he had never been in the room before. She undressed him, and as she did so, she realized he was wearing his work clothes, not the suit he had been buried in, the suit he had worn on their wedding day. She pulled back the covers and told him to lie down. He did so with silent obedience. She slid in beside him and kissed him. His kiss was both familiar and foreign to her. His lips were soft and passive where they had always been firm and insistent before, and there was no warmth there. But the texture and the taste of him was the same. They made love, Teresa initiating and leading where Ray had always taken charge before, and while her heart overflowed with the joy of being held by her husband once more, her body shivered at the iciness of his touch. When Teresa woke the next morning, sunlight touching her eyelids, she reached out without opening her eyes, but her fingers encountered nothing. Ray's side of the bed was empty, the covers pulled up as if he had never been there. She sat up abruptly.
Ray?
There was no answer. She searched the house, calling out for him several times, but he was gone. She returned to the bedroom, feeling both confused and sorrowful. Where had he gone, and would he not come back? And then, shortly after noon, Her phone rang. The screen said Ray. She answered it.
Ray?
Reese,
He said, his voice sounding even more raspy and unused than before.
don't worry. I know there's a shooter. I'm coming home.
The line went dead, and Teresa set her phone down. Her chest nodded in a cacophony of emotions, sorrow, hope, frustration, and even fear, that she realized she could hardly feel anything anymore. But come home he did, and this became their new pattern, the new vicious cycle they were stuck in. Every day he would come home, every day looking even more pale and feeling even more cold to the touch, his personality receding even further into the empty shell that he was becoming, a vacancy behind the eyes that had once been so passionate and full of life. Teresa had to tell him to sit, to eat, to bathe himself. He was like an elderly man who was losing use of his faculties, and Teresa evolved into his loving but confused and somewhat terrified caretaker. And every morning, Ray's side of the bed would be empty again, and he would call Teresa from work shortly after noon to tell her that he was coming home. Teresa noticed that each time, his voice sounded more like it was being dragged over stones.
Like his vocal cords are decaying.
She thought. It was not long before his countenance began to catch up with his voice. He began to look more physically withered, his tall frame beginning to bend, his eyes large in their sockets as his face became even more wan and his cheeks more sunken. Teresa allowed this cycle to continue for months, her love for her husband locking her in a living hell, but she was rapidly reaching the point of collapse herself, her emotional and mental well-being withering right along with Ray's countenance.
I'm coming home,
He had said to her over the phone, his voice like dusty rocks being rubbed together, barely recognizable to her.
Wait,
She had said,
Ray, don't. Don't come home. Stay there. It's okay. Stay there.
No,
He responded, slowly and without emotion.
no, if I stay here, I'll die. I'm coming home.
Teresa had hung up the phone, wept, and waited once more for her husband to return. She wept because her husband was dead. She wept because he was alive and yet dying more every day before her very eyes. She wept because she felt bound to him in whatever repeating loop that his death and their love had created. And she wept because they were together again, and yet she felt entirely alone. Finally, on the day that Teresa took her own life, she made a decision that came to her easily and without fear. In fact, the idea gave her the first comfort she had felt in the years since Ray had died. Perhaps the key to escaping this living hell was to die herself. More precisely, to die beside Ray as they slept together in bed, and in the morning, when he was gone, perhaps she could be gone too. Gone, but together. She called me that afternoon to tell me her story, to tell me her plan, and to tell me goodbye. I listened with terrified disbelief as she recounted the details of her miserable life in the months since Ray had died. Her story was one I could not accept as fact, and yet simultaneously I knew from the sound of her tired yet determined voice that my daughter was telling me the absolute truth. "Is Ray there now?" I asked her.
Yes?
She said tiredly.
Do you want to talk to him?
I didn't answer, but then I heard Teresa say distantly,
It's Dad. Talk to him.
There was a shuffling sound, followed by a raspy breath. "Ray?" I said, and I was surprised to find my own voice was trembling. He didn't respond, but I could hear as he attempted to. All I heard was the sound of his laborious breath and the vaguely recognizable tones of his voice as he attempted to speak, but his words were garbled, his voice wasted. Teresa took the phone back.
I have to go now, Daddy.
"Baby, don't do this," I said, crying but trying to hold myself together. I love you. Your mother loves you. Let us help you. There has to be some other way." Teresa began to cry.
There is no other way, Daddy. This is the only way.
"No," I insisted. "You still have so much to live for. Let me take you away from there. You can come here. Maybe Ray won't come to you anymore if you're not there." I felt myself playing along with her, even though I wasn't sure I even fully believed her.
Daddy, there's something else.
She said, taking a long and exhausted breath.
I'm pregnant.
I started, then stopped. A hard lump rose in my throat. I couldn't breathe. My mind pieced it together. Teresa was pregnant, and Ray had been dead for more than a year.
It's Ray's.
She said, answering the question I hadn't asked.
But I don't know what it is. I just know I can't, Daddy. I just can't.
She wept. She said her final goodbyes to me, ignoring my pleading, and then the call was over. I already told you how the police found her. The autopsy revealed that she had died consuming a large number of sleeping pills left helpfully behind by her best friend Cheryl. The autopsy also revealed that she had been several months pregnant. I insisted that this detail never be revealed to her mother. Estranged and distant though we are, there are some horrors a mother should be spared when it comes to her own child. So this, as I said, is Teresa's story, and the story of her husband Ray. And you may not believe me, but it's an absolutely true story. As fantastical as that might sound, I believe Teresa now. Although 2 weeks ago, when she told me her story for the first time, of course I had doubted her. I doubt her no more, not a single detail, because every day she calls to tell me all over again. As a kid, I was a picky eater, like I assume most children are. As my parents tell me, my eating habits transcended normal childhood proclamations of, "I don't like broccoli," and evolved into a refusal to eat absolutely anything of substance. Things other children might eat and enjoy, like chicken nuggets, spaghetti, or even hot dogs, were shunned by toddler me. It got to the point, they say, where they and my pediatrician became concerned for my health. I stopped growing properly, falling well below the typical percentiles for a children's height and weight, and the rest of my development seemed stunted as a result. Phrases were tossed around like failure to thrive and tube feed. In the end, my parents were forced to feed me calorie-loaded milkshakes made with nutrient-enriched formula every night in a bid to get me to gain weight. Honestly, I don't know why they put up with it. I sound like I was a little shit. The milkshake regime extended past toddlerhood and into my childhood. At 5 years old, I was still refusing to eat food, despite the countless nights my parents sent me to bed hungry for refusing to even try my dinner. I was still small for my age and spent more than a little time in the hospital due to the starvation of my body. My parents would later tell me that they were sure I was going to be taken away by the state because of how emaciated I appeared. Thankfully, they were in constant contact with doctors who monitored the situation, so there was undeniable proof that my case wasn't due to neglect. At 6 years old, when I should have been starting school, I was still a small kid. My body never received enough nutrients to grow properly, despite my forced feedings, and as a result, my speech and physical movements were stunted, leaving me a 6-year-old that had behaved more like a 3-year-old. Again, I don't know how my parents coped. I can remember the day I discovered a food I actually liked. It was September 22nd, 1997. I was at the grocery store with my mother, sitting in the child seat of the cart because my frail legs couldn't handle walking for too long. Mother looked tired and weary, and I can remember staring at the deep lines that seemed etched into her face as she pushed the cart silently through the small store in an attempt to find something or anything that could tempt me to eat. And then I saw it. A jar of jam. I'd tried jam before and hated it. The texture, the stickiness, the overwhelming sweetness. Vile. But this jar, it seemed different to my 6-year-old mind. I pointed it out to my mother, my bony finger extended to the glass jar with the plain white label that read, Mrs. Willison's homemade jam.
What, sweetie? What do you see?
My mother's voice was almost as weary as her face as her eyes followed my outstretched hand. When her gaze landed on the jar, her head snapped back toward me like it was elasticated.
You want that, Marky?
The excitement in her voice was barely contained.
You want to try that?
I nodded my head. My mother grabbed the jar of jam off the shelf faster than I'd ever seen her move before. She even smiled. I couldn't remember the last time I saw her do that. We paid for the jam and left the store without so much as bothering to shop for the rest of our groceries. Mother hurried me out to the car, excitedly strapping me into the seat, before placing the jar of jam in the front almost reverently. This was the first time I was actually showing interest in food. She was thrilled. The town I grew up in was small, populated by a mere 350 people. The drive from the grocery store to my house took under 5 minutes. Really, we could have walked if I wasn't so frail. When we got home, Mother excitedly ushered me into the house with the jar of jam clenched tightly in her hand. Immediately, she sat me down at the table as if she were afraid I'd suddenly change my mind and refuse to try what I had picked out. But my mind and gaze were focused on that jar. It didn't look like the other jams I had tried. It didn't seem lumpy or thick, and there were no seeds. Something about it intrigued my dull little mind, though I can't explain what it was, even now.
Here, Marky. You want to try this?
My mother held out a spoon laden with jam. It was a deep red and seemed to glisten under the kitchen lighting. I remember taking the spoon carefully and raising it to my face, peering at it closely. Anxiously, my mother waited. Slowly, my tongue darted out to taste it. I can't even describe to you what that first taste was like. Imagine the most amazing thing you've ever eaten, coupled with the most euphoric you've ever felt, and that would get you close to what the experience of tasting that jam was for me. I ate everything off the spoon in seconds and silently asked for more. My mother, with tears in her eyes, handed me another spoonful, which I lapped up eagerly. After my 5th spoonful, my mother was openly sobbing and dashing for the phone to call my father and tell him the wonderful news. Meanwhile, I remained entranced by the jar. As a child, I wouldn't have been able to describe the taste to you, my palate being limited as it was, but as an adult, I can tell you that it's a deep, rich flavor, a combination of sweet and savory that was perfectly balanced. It didn't taste like strawberries or raspberries, but a combination of the two mixed with some sort of saltiness that seemed to heighten it. I suppose it's a lot like how some people like salted caramel, the combination of sweet and salty. It was bliss. My father stopped by the grocery store on his way home from work and bought another jar. And so, for the next 2 weeks, that became the only thing I ate. I would have jam for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, followed by my enhanced milkshakes in the evening. My parents were thrilled. They hoped that my sudden liking of this food would lead me to liking other foods too. Then, one day, when my mother and I went to the grocery store to buy more of the jam, we found the spot on the shelf where it usually sat empty. Mother, slightly panicked, rushed to the front of the store to ask if they had any more of Mrs. Willison's homemade jam.
Sorry, we're all out right now.
My mother's face fell, and she threw a worried glance in my direction.
When will you get more?
The clerk scratched his beard thoughtfully.
You see, it's actually made by a local lady, Mrs. Wilson. She sold it to Hector to resell in the store. She said she only had so many jars available, and no one else seems to like it but your boy there.
I was beginning to grow irritated from being in the cart and not having had my jam for lunch. My fussing drew Mother's attention, and she stared at me worriedly.
Is there any way I could get Mrs. Willinson's address or phone number? That jam is the only thing Mark will eat.
Like is common in most small towns, everyone knows the business of everyone else. So, the clerk was aware of my parents' struggles in getting me to eat food. He must have felt sympathetic towards my mother's sudden stress because he searched in the back office for the invoice that held Mrs. Willison's address. That afternoon, Mother and I sought out the elusive jam maker. She lived in a cottage on the outskirts of town in a gingerbread-style house that would be described as idyllic nowadays. When Mother knocked on the door, a young woman answered. She was small, with blonde hair in a tight bun and a sad face.
Can I help you?
Her voice was soft, and, years later, Mother would tell me that there was something about Mrs. Willison that was so dejected and forlorn. But desperation is a wonderful motivator, and my mother wanted to keep me eating, so she pasted on a smile and explained the situation to the young woman at the door.
Oh, that is so wonderful.
Mrs. Willison exclaimed, smiling for the first time since she came to the door.
I am so happy he likes it. It's an old family recipe, and when Hector said it wasn't selling very well, I thought maybe I messed up the batch.
My mother asked if Mrs. Willison had any more jam, and with a smile, the woman retreated into her house and returned a moment later with a box.
This is the last of it. I've kept a few jars to myself, but since it seems so unpopular, I didn't think I was going to make another batch.
This is amazing.
Mother said, seeming to sag under the weight of the box and the relief she felt.
I don't know what it is about this jam he loves so much.
Mrs. Willison laughed.
I'm just glad I didn't mess it up the way I was thinking I had.
My mother offered to pay the other woman, but she refused, saying that seeing someone enjoy her creation was payment enough. We left with a dozen jars. We managed to stretch those out for several months, though I hated having to ration my precious confection. One day, a few weeks after I had turned 7, we saw Mrs. Willison in town. She waved a cheery greeting to my mother and waddled her way over, her round, protruding stomach making her slightly off balance.
Congratulations!
My mother exclaimed when she drew nearer. Mrs. Willison thanked her and rubbed her stomach. I stood there wondering if she had any more jam to give me.
I haven't made any recently,
She said in answer to my brisk question.
but maybe soon.
I was annoyed but resigned. My mother was just happy I was finally starting to act like a normal kid who ate and talked. So what if all I ate was jam, she thought. At least I was eating. A few more weeks passed and we ran out of jam. The grocery store no longer stocked it, so Mother and I made a visit to Mrs. Willison. When she answered the door, I noticed her stomach wasn't round anymore, and she once again looked sad. She invited us inside, the offer of jam having me run into the house before my mother had a chance to reply. I sat patiently at her round kitchen table while she spread jam onto slices of bread. My mother watched in earnest as I looked at the bread suspiciously before picking it up and nibbling it. To my relief, the sweet and savory taste of the jam overpowered the bread taste, and I greedily ate it down. My mother sagged in relief, seeing this as another victory in the battle of my eating habits. I ate several more pieces of toast with jam while Mrs. Willison and Mother talked. I ignored their conversation in favor of eating my treat, occasionally catching words like stillborn and devastated, but paying no mind. Before we left, my mother hugged Mrs. Willison tightly. She didn't have any jam to give me that day, but promised me soon. I left with a full belly and the anticipation of more of my sweet treat soon. For years, this pattern went on. Mother and Mrs. Willison developed a sort of friendship, and when we would go and visit every few months, they would sit at Mrs. Willison's kitchen table and talk while I ate jam. Eventually, Mother began putting the jam on other foods to see if I would eat them. I tried chicken, beef, bananas, and apples, all smothered in my delicious jam, and ate every bit. Mother and Father practically sobbed in relief. By the time I was 12, I was eating more foods, but still relied on the jam. If it didn't have jam literally coating it, then I wouldn't try it. That jam seemed to mask every other flavor, and I used it like people use ketchup or gravy. In this time, Mrs. Willison seemed to age quickly, and her production of jam slowed. She told me and Mother that it was hard on her body, making the jam. It was a long process and very labor-intensive. I worried about the day when she might no longer make it for me, but she simply patted my head and told me that she'd make it as long as I wanted it. I smiled. By the time I was 18, I was better with food, but still hated the taste and texture of it. Mrs. Willison's jam was the only food I'd ever actually liked or wanted to eat of my own accord, and she still supplied me with it. Her frequency of batches lessened to only once a year or more, but when I finally got those jars of the rich, red goodness, I was thrilled. After high school was over, I moved away for college, but every time I returned home, I made sure to stop in and visit Mrs. Willison. She seemed to grow lonely as she aged, and I often wondered where her husband was or if she even had one. When asked what she did for work, she just said she was in the business of making people happy. I wasn't sure what that meant, but figured it was something to do with her amazing jam. More years passed. Despite my unusual tendencies as a child, I grew into a rather successful normal man. I work in data entry, which is as boring as it sounds, and am married to a wonderful woman who, at first, was annoyed with my weird eating habits, but came to accept that I just don't like the stuff. Doesn't matter what it is, I just don't like food. I have never, and likely will never, eat food for the joy of it, unless we count jam, of course. My wife doesn't like it, but she's used to it now, I think. A few weeks ago, we returned home to visit my parents. As I've been doing for years, I made a point to visit Mrs. Willison. She's older now, and time has been unkind to her. Her body seems frail, as if it has carried heavy burdens for years, and she no longer stands upright, but she still smiled when she saw me, and smiled even wider when she met my wife. We had a nice visit, her getting to know my wife and catching up on what has been happening in my life. Just before I left, she gave me a box of jam.
I'm afraid this is it, Mark dear.
Her voice sounded as frail as her body looked, and for the first time, the idea that I could lose Mrs. Willison popped into my head. Even though she was only in her 50s, she seemed much older. She'd been part of my life for so long now, I couldn't imagine no longer being able to see her.
I'm too old for making jam now.
She said with a sigh.
My body, it just won't allow it. These things happen. Best to leave it to the young ones.
She smiled weakly, but I could tell she was sad. Tears prickled my eyes as I set the box of jam jars on the ground and wrapped her frail body in a tight hug. "Thank you for sharing your jam with me for as long as you have," I said, then kissed her forehead gently. Mrs. Willison smiled and waved me and my wife off as we left. That was a few weeks ago. Today, I got a call from my mother. She was sobbing uncontrollably. It took me a long time to finally figure out what she was saying, and when I did, hell, I didn't know what to think. I sat there at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, with a plate of jam toast in front of me, while my mother told me Mrs. Willison had passed away. It appeared she had died several days ago, but no one knew until my mother went for her weekly visit and found the other woman slumped over in her chair. There was nothing they could do. I stared at my jam toast and felt numb.
But that's not the worst of it, Mark.
My mother sobbed. "What, Mom?"
Oh, God. Mark, what they found. God, I'm so sorry.
She broke down into incoherent sobbing. Eventually, my father took the phone from her and explained what the police had found in Mrs. Willison's house when they arrived. I'm still not sure what to think of it. "Son, I hope you're sitting down for this," my father began. No one knew what a crazy, sick bitch she was, I swear." He cleared his throat and sounded like he was fighting back his own tears. "I'm just sorry we fed you that shit for so long." My eyes immediately went to the jam, my precious jam. "The police searched her house. In the cellar, they found the area where she made her jam. Jesus, son, it was kids. God damn it, it was kids. Her own babies." It turns out Mrs. Willison's jam was homemade in a very literal sense. She had, a year before I first ever tried her jam, gotten pregnant and then miscarried at home. Apparently, it created some sort of mental break in her brain, and for God knows what reason, she decided to incorporate the baby, fetus, whatever, into the jam. She cooked it with the berries, strained it, and took care not to have any fragments in the final product. That's why it was always so perfectly clear and free of seeds. It's also why it took so long for her to make her batches. After the first one, she decided to try again with both the pregnancy and, when that ended too, ended in a second trimester miscarriage, the jam. For over 20 years, Mrs. Willison lived in a cycle of getting herself pregnant, which she apparently achieved by acting as a prostitute in the larger neighboring town, and then aborting the pregnancies at home, sometime between the 12th and 20th week, when the ingredient was large enough to be made into a batch. That was why she only made one batch of jam a year, and why she appeared to age so quickly and harshly. In the end, when she said her body could no longer support jam making, she was telling the truth. My parents were horrified. For years, they had been feeding me this stuff. For years, they had been gleefully shoveling this jam into my system, ignorant of the fact that it was made with human remains. They had been so thrilled when I had started eating normal food, so thrilled when 6-year-old me had pointed to that jar of jam and then taken it so eagerly. My mother apologized profusely on the phone through her sobs. When the call ended, I looked down at the plate of jam toast in front of me, studying the deep red spread with its flawlessly smooth consistency and the sweet and savory combination of it that had been the only food I had ever actually enjoyed in my life. Silently, I rose from my chair and went to the cellar where I stored my box of jams. Mrs. Willison made 12 jars of each batch, and I had learned to stretch that very carefully over the years. I still had 11 remaining. Carefully, I looked through the box, taking out each and every jar and inspecting it, as if trying to see tiny particles of fetuses that had been cooked into each one. At the very bottom of the box, I found an envelope. I reached for it with a shaking hand and pulled out letters from Mrs. Willison. It was short, not saying much, but I smiled to read it all the same. I've always had issues with food. I don't know why. Most children grow out of their picky eating, and to some extent, I did too. I learned over time that I needed food to live, though eating it brings me no joy and makes me sick if I find a texture or a taste I can't stand. Mrs. Willison's jam saved me. It has been the first and only food I have ever liked, the only one I willingly and gladly ate. And in that envelope that I found at the bottom of my last box of jars, the last batch Mrs. Willison made, I found her legacy to me. Something she wanted me to have before she died because she said I was the bright spot of her life and she had done this all for me. The sound of my wife moving around upstairs manages to reach me in the basement. She's awake late because she's had a difficult time sleeping lately. Whistling to myself, I put the index card back into the envelope and leave my box of jam in the same place as before. Then, I climb the stairs to the kitchen where I find my wife standing at the stove, scrambling eggs. She turns to me and smiles, her hair tousled from sleep and her face serene, not yet twisted up in agony due to her morning sickness. She turns and kisses me, and I feel the soft swell of her pregnant stomach against my body. Our last trip home had been to surprise my parents with the pregnancy. She's 12 weeks now, so she says it's safe to tell people the news. Of course, my parents were thrilled. So was Mrs. Willison, which is why I think she left me the recipe. I think if I push her hard enough, I might be able to get my wife to make some jam for me. In 2012, between late January and the first half of February, there were 16 days of radio silence from a Russian expedition on Antarctica. The group of researchers had been meaning to reach and study Lake Vostok, a subterranean body of water that lay almost 4,000 meters below the surface and hadn't been in contact with the outside air for over 20,000 years. The initial crew consisted of 8 people, but only one of them returned. He was found by a Norwegian station 30 kilometers away from the supposed entrance to the lake, almost frozen to death and terrified. Hours earlier, he had broken the radio silence, muttering simply, "Help." When he was sent back, I was tasked with interviewing him for the institution. To protect their privacy, his name and the names of his colleagues were changed. My office was cozy and welcoming when he entered, escorted by guards. He seemed grateful to sit by the fire and remain silent and still until we were left alone. "Welcome, Mr. Ivanova. Please take your time. Would you like a hot beverage?" He nodded. I handed him a steaming cup. "Nice to meet you. I'm Victor." I went ahead. He was trembling, and his eyes showed fear and suspicion, but his shoulders loosened a little. "My name is Chris." "Well, it's nice to meet you. How old are you, Chris?" "I'm 36. "I'm 37. When's your birthday?" After a few minutes of idle talk to have him warm up to me, he started telling me his story. The 8 of us had been together at the station for 3 months before we were sent to uncover this lake, so we were pretty familiar with each other, at least with our own team. We were 2 groups of 4, taking shifts. The first group consisted of our leader, Dr. Oblonsky, and 3 older men, one of them a professional wilderness photographer. I believe the 4 of them were in their mid-50s. They were polite, but we rarely saw each other or talked. The second group consisted of myself, Alexander Goncharov, Dr. Ivan Yohantov, and Miroslav. I felt blessed to be with them. Alexander was the younger of us, 29 years old, I believe, the most agreeable person you'll ever know. Dr. Ivan was funny and around 5 years older than me, and Miroslav was nice and beautiful. I think it was inevitable that we got together because of the confinement, but I really liked her. Were you in love? I think in love would be an overstatement, but I think we were great together. We made plans to see each other after we came back home, since we lived 2 hours from each other. Did you have any problems with anyone in your group? Everyone got along okay, I believe, or at least I was cool with all the others. Dr. Oblonsky was a fine leader, and sometimes one of the guys from his team would have a heated discussion with him, but it was all professional. Everyone just wanted to do what was best for our research. How did your coworkers feel about you and Miroslav dating? Dr. Ivan was our vice leader. He knew about us and he didn't mind, and Alexander knew too, since he was always there. Dr. Oblonsky was never informed of our relationship, or the others. We didn't think it to be necessary. The week before the expedition started, Dr. Oblonsky held a meeting with everyone. It was decided that his group was going 1 day ahead from the rest of us, because they were the most experienced ones. You know what that means. They wanted the discovery all for themselves, and we were only their backup in case they needed to be rescued. Still, Dr. Ivan graciously agreed. The 4 of us weren't as important as the others, so we weren't about to make a scene about it.
Considering our age, I'm sure we'll get other chances,
Dr. Ivan said. Poor him. We all woke up early on the first day of the expedition. We saw the others off, and they said some things on the radio every now and then. The entrance to the lake was a big cave, and from then we would have to hike the 4 kilometers.
We can't find the entrance,
Dr. Oblonsky complained on the radio. Half an hour later, he complained about feeling watched, and then informed us that he found the entrance on the very same spot he had been standing, like it magically opened. We thought the snow was starting to confuse him. He was experienced, of course, but this was a first-time thing for everyone. After they entered the cave, we understandably lost radio contact. It wasn't a concern at first. We left the next day at the assigned time. We too had a hard time finding the entrance. It took us so long that we almost gave up and went back to the station. How did you finally find it? It was pretty much the same as Dr. Oblonsky described. It wasn't there. Then we felt observed, and suddenly it was there. Like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Inside the cave was so dark and moist, I thought I was going to collapse. It smelled strongly like rotten fish, and our flashlights revealed a deep red interior full of bright white icicles. The ceiling was a perfect arc, no less than 30 meters tall, and the ground had a strange, grainy and wet texture. It was strangely warmer than you'd imagine. I mean, it was still considerably cold. We measured it, and it was like 2 degrees Celsius, but way less cold than the outside. Warm caves weren't unheard of, but it wasn't what we expected.
What are the walls made of?
Alexander had asked with curiosity. When he touched it, it throbbed lightly. The first sign of our companions was a thick rope tied strongly to one of the many ice stalagmites. It indicated that the path went down, and we followed closely. After walking for around an hour, slightly descending, the floor changed from the grainy texture to something similar to the ceiling and walls. It seemed to be sculpted to look like millions of red bones. As soon as we stepped on the new ground, there was a noise that made everything tremble, like the roar of a beast or the loudest of yaws. Our feet started sinking in a light violet, sticky substance that was flowing from the nether parts of the cave. It was flowing in reverse, upstream. I jumped back to the grainy part, still safe from the strange liquid, and Alexander followed. Miroslav and Dr. Ivan had decided to go ahead, but the light violet quickly turned into a thick, dark purple ooze that soon surrounded their feet. At first, it only covered their heels, but quickly engulfed the rest of their bodies, and soon they sank and were completely taken by the horrible liquid. From where we stood, Alexander and I watched in horror as our 2 companions were dissolved alive. At least it looked painless, though. It was so quick they probably barely realized their bodies were disappearing. I was paralyzed, mesmerized.
We need to go back.
Alexander urged me, and we started running towards the entrance of the cave. He was leading the way, always looking above his shoulder to see if I was following. He didn't even see when the stalactites and stalagmites closed in around him like an Iron Maiden. My colleague and friend was gone in a second, impaled by sharp teeth, his blood staining the pearly white icicles. There was no doubt to me now. I was inside something alive, and even worse, I was caught between the teeth of the beast and its gastric juices, all alone. The icicles remained closed around Alexander's body, blocking my exit and leaving me trapped. The only thing I had left was the tightly tied rope, straightened over the pool of deadly acid. Most likely, this purple river wasn't there when the first group crossed. Taking a deep breath and leaving most of my equipment behind, I walked over the cable, knowing that falling meant certain death. After a while, the ground, or the beast's throat, became lower and lower, far enough from the cord that I could just hold it above my head. After reaching the end of the cable, I walked for God knows how long. My knowledge of anatomy allowed me to find my way around the acid and be able to circumvent the large pools of it. I started noticing some green lumps that floated above the gastric juice, unscathed. Some were small, some were bigger than me, clearly some undigested matter. Is it too far-fetched to tell you that I jumped in one of them and used it as a boat of sorts? Well, everything else I've been through is unbelievable. That's how I made it through the digestive system. When I felt hungry, I tried eating pieces of my boat, having nothing else around. And it didn't kill me, so I continued eating small chunks of the thing to survive. I didn't have the faintest idea of what it was, but it kept me alive. I slept and pissed there in my little boat, and soon the smell of my own waste overwhelmed the smell of the dead fishes. I slept 3 times before I found the rest of my crew, which means they survived longer than my original group did. According to my clumsy and imprecise calculations, Considering how big the mouth of the monster was, I was near the end of the beast's stomach, heading for the small intestine when I found Dr. Oblonsky and the others. He and a second fellow researcher were preserved inside some sort of amber with terrified expressions on their faces. They had been alive for a long time inside that thing before dying. Hell, they could have still been alive when I passed them. I just had no way of saving anyone. The others were pressed against the side of the beast's stomach like when you crush a particularly fat mosquito on the wall. The light violet liquid dripped from the ceiling, slowly digesting them. The nature of their deaths made me realize that I'd been dealing with something new. Whatever secreted that amber thing on Dr. Oblonsky was probably a huge structure that crushed the other two. Shortly after this occurred to me, huge, strange tentacle-like membranes fell from the little crevices on the ceiling. They seemed to detect living things from the smell, so I did the worst thing I had to do until now. I lied on my belly on the boat and covered myself in feces. That's how I avoided being preserved in an eternal scream somewhere where no one could reach or save me. As the boat headed to the intestines, the sea of acid became a beautiful, ethereal blue. The liquid was calm and crystalline, and I believed it was the infamous Lake Vostok. Even the noise, the constant strange whirring, and the horrible smell subsided, giving place to a strange, all-consuming peace. I saw multiple creatures petrified inside the amber on the side of the lake. Things that looked like algae and jellyfish, horseshoe crabs, sponges, and shrimps and sturgeons, sharks and seals, all ancient and eerie. After that, a row of rabbits and frogs, strange penguins, giant butterflies, a primitive man, a primitive bear, 3 mammoths, and a humanoid taller than 4 meters in fetal position. Still on the lake, I traveled through strange chambers where the clear liquid underneath was filled with strange fossils. Some had 20 eyes, some had 3 legs and 8 heads. Some were made mostly of tongues, some were brains with long limbs, some were just indescribable. They blinked and twitched or moved their heads in my direction to face me like they were alive but dormant. The mouth, esophagus, and stomach of the creature had been so dark, but the duodenum was filled with a mystical polar blue radiance. The ceiling was full of beautiful crystals of salt that reflected the light like a heavenly kaleidoscope. It was like I was in the very uterus of creation, the starting point of the planet, the birth of things that have been and will be. I was at the same time taken aback by its horrifying beauty. Terrified and intrigued, I wished I had something to take pictures with, but I had left it all back with my gear. The only things I kept were my clothes, flashlights, and a small radio in case I ever got out. Our cameras were too heavy. After seeing all sorts of inexpressible creatures, my boat entered what I believed to be the giant's jejunum. That was dark and awful again. Instead of a vast lake, I was now sailing on just a narrow stream. At this point, I feel like I blacked out for a long time. Thinking back, it's almost like the monster wanted me to exit its body. Maybe it thought, now that it's gotten this far, I'll let it go. Maybe it wanted the world to know about it. This part is all hazy, but I know that it was horribly disgusting to travel through its ilium. Being shot by the monster was an indescribable trauma. I'll just say that I lost my boat and thought I was going to die of suffocation, but instead I saw the light outside. I was covered by a jet black mud, but it melted in contact with the snow. I asked for help on the radio and passed out in the middle of a snowstorm. Then, when I woke up again, I laughed at the idea of hypothermia killing me after everything I went through. So I just stumbled through the snow until I saw a building in the distance. The rest you know. The Norwegians found me and saved my life. In my report, I made sure to emphasize that Chris Ivanova sounded lucid and intelligent. If his story was fake, he certainly wasn't making it up for attention, but truly believed that it happened. Physically, he looked pitiful, but it was understandable after being lost for 16 days. My superiors, however, thought it was utter nonsense, just the delusions of a traumatized survivor. Unfortunately, I never saw Chris again, but I had heard that he died a year after our interview. After that, I moved on with my life. As a psychiatrist for a governmental agency, I interviewed other people that were lost and told strange stories. Some almost as strange as his, and I almost forgot him. Until recently. Lately, I've been feeling rather ill. My skin has been turning slightly purple, and it's like these strange lumps pop up right under my skin every now and again. They're painless but solid, and no doctor was able to give me a conclusive diagnosis. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but they look like small eyes. It reminded me of his story. On a whim, I decided to look up the people who had been in contact with Chris back then. The Norwegians, the guards, even my former boss. As of today, all of the people who had been in contact with him are either sick or dying. Terrified for my health, I decided to sneak in and check his file. I intended to review what we talked about, looking for clues for whatever disease I have. His file was last updated a year after our conversation, with a picture of his corpse. As per the time of his death, Chris had 20 eyes, and his limbs had turned into tongues. I was referred by a temp agency. I had no idea who I was working for or what the job would entail. I only knew that the pay was good. A week-long excursion at $7.25 a night, more than enough to pay off a couple credit card bills and a good chunk of next month's rent. For that price, I would have done almost anything. I only wish I knew at the time what I was getting myself into. When I arrived at the address, I was surprised. It was a large facility at the end of a dirt road in the woods, 2 towns over. The large sign outside read Synthetic Corp. It was a plain, white, 3-story building, void of identifying markings. Its appearance gave me no clue to its purpose. Its location was even more baffling. Going off the name alone, I had to assume it was some sort of biotech company. I was probably needed to clean up radioactive waste or something to that end. For what they were paying me, I would be happy to risk my health. Upon entering the building, I was meeting with the receptionist. I was directed to room 371 on the 2nd floor, where I would wait for Al, my new boss. It was your standard office setting, albeit more quaint than usual. Red carpet, white walls, no windows. Only 6 desks in 3 rows of 2, each with their own computer. At the back of the room was a large wall covered by a one-way mirror, an opening with steps on either side of it. Inside was a single chair, desk, and landline phone, probably a place for the supervisors to oversee productivity. Other than that, the room harbored no points of interest, unless you fancied the waste bin and the fern in the corner. An old gentleman opened the door to the room and came over to shake my hand, introducing himself as Owl. He seemed to be in a rush, wasting no time in describing the task at hand. I was to stay in that very room from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. the following day, every night for a week. He left me his cell phone number and a laminated list of rules to follow. He told me he could not overstate enough the importance of following each and every one, exactly as they were outlined. Once he was sure I understood the gravity of the situation, he left me to my first shift in peace, closing the door behind him. That was it? Really? Just stay in the room for 10 hours a night? I had no clue as to why I was being paid over $5,000 to room sit, but I learned some time ago to never look a gift horse in the mouth. I simply sat down at the overseer's room with a smile on my face and went over the list of rules. There were 10 in total. All of them left me more than a little confused. 1. Once 8 rolls around, lock the door, and do not leave the room for any reason until 6. Plan your bathroom usage and meal periods accordingly. No food or drink items within the room. Do not use Hank's computer. It's the closest to the exit. No one is ever to touch it under any circumstances, not even Hank. If the phone rings, answer it, but do not talk. No matter what the voice on the other end says, you are not to respond. Hang up after 2 minutes have passed. Do not let the janitor in. We don't have one. If anyone else comes to the floor, let them in, but ignore them. Do not react whatsoever. When they leave, shut the door and lock it behind them. If the waste bin changes locations, place it back in the corner as soon as you notice. If I stop by, only let me in if I know the password. At 9:30 precisely, set each of the computer's home screens to different URLs except Hank's. Do not react to the images. Act normal. If you see Harvey, feed him one of the treats from Lisa's desk, the one opposite Hank's. If there's an emergency, call my cell, but not after 10:05 p.m. Below the last rule was a final sentiment, scribbled over the laminate in pen. No one has made it past night 3. Good luck. I was perplexed, wondering for a moment if Al was a lunatic and if that was the reason no one else had lasted. Perhaps his quirks were too much for the previous candidates and they backed out, fearing for their safety at the hands of this fragile mind. I would not be swayed so easily. Even if Al was crazy, I would be happy to take his money for what was shaping up to be a very simple job. At least, that's what I thought. Day 1 was utterly boring. Nothing remarkable happened, definitely not anything to the extent of what Al's list would have me expect. At 9:30, I even changed the URLs on the computers, if for no other reason than to feel somewhat useful. The next night, however, was a little different. Day 2 started as it normally did. I settled in for another long night, making sure to eat and empty my bladder before locking myself in. At 9:25, just as I was about to ready myself to change the home screens again, I saw it. The waste bin was right there at the top of the steps to the overseer's room. I certainly hadn't placed it there. I felt a small spike in my adrenaline before calming down with a smile. The waste bin, the list, it was all a joke at my expense. Al would be in the next room, waiting anxiously to see the look on my face. I raced out of the office door. There was no one there. I walked over to the exit and shook the knob. It was still locked. Confused and a tinge scared, I swiftly picked up the waste bin and walked it back over to the corner of the room. I checked the time, 9:30. I started changing the URLs on all of the computers, hoping desperately that I had imagined what just occurred. After skipping Hank's desk, I typed in the last website on PC number 6. I was about to pull away when some strange imagery manifested on the screen. It was surveillance footage of the room. The very room I was in. I saw me looking at the computer. I turned and looked up, but there was no camera. Upon looking back at the screen, I saw something terrifying. I watched as a copy of me stepped out from the overseer's room. It walked up behind me, grabbed a hard drive from one of the desks, and wound up to strike me in the back of the head. I quickly turned to shield myself. There was no one there. I turned back and the screen changed, displaying the website I had entered as normal. I raced back to the overseer's room and sat down, more than a bit frazzled. I contemplated walking out, but I steeled myself to continue. I was fine, after all. Maybe Al wasn't a lunatic, but he didn't seem the type to wish me any harm. Not that I knew him all that well. Still, I hadn't sustained any injury. I was questioning my sanity, yes, but no bodily injuries had befallen me. Whatever was at play here seemed harmless so far. There was a loud banging. Having just had the most horrifying experience in my life, I nearly jumped out of my skin. A voice then penetrated the door.
"It's the janitor. I'm just here to clean up. Can you open the door?"
I recalled rule number 4 and denied him entry. You did good not letting him in. You followed the rule, now you're fine. So long as you follow the rules, you'll be safe. It's as simple as that. You can see this through. I jumped again.
I really need to get in there to clean up. Open the door.
I took a deep breath and peeled back my anxiety, successfully ignoring the janitor until he left. This was an accomplishment for me, and it actually felt pretty good. A challenge that I was able to best. Though I remained on the edge of my seat, the next few hours were uneventful. I even dozed off for a moment at one point. It wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that my next challenge would come. A multicolored cat jumped up on the desk in front of me, complete with beautiful splotches of black and orange. I was startled, but it seemed to be friendly, brushing up against my arm, the name on its collar, Harvey. I knew what I had to do. I rummaged through Lisa's desk, found the jar of treats, and fed Harvey one, to which he purred in delight. To my astonishment, he then charged at the door, phasing right through it. My mouth was agape in awe. Once my initial bewilderment dissipated, it was replaced with satisfaction over another small victory. As strange as it may sound, I was beginning to like the job. It was the landline. Remembering the rules, I removed it from the receiver and held it to my ear, making sure to keep an eye on the time.
Hey, it's Al. I'm just going to be stopping by pretty soon to do a little work. How's the job treating you so far?
I remained silent.
Hello? You know you can talk if it's me, right?
I picked up a set of rules and looked them over. There was nothing about Al calling. I didn't respond.
This is no way to treat your employer. If you don't say anything, I'll have no choice but to fire you. Do you really want that?
I stood my ground. Only 20 seconds to go.
Fine. I'll see you soon to relieve you of your duty. I guess you couldn't even make it past night 2.
The 2-minute mark came and I hung up on him. I felt safe as another hour went by, reflecting on the trials I had faced thus far. I was bewildered but determined. I wasn't going to let the room cloud my judgment. I was in control.
It's Lisa. Can I come in?
Though hesitant, I had to abide by Rule 5. I opened the door and a woman entered.
You must be the new guy. What do you think of the place?
I went back to my desk in the overseer's room and sat down, trying my best to act casual. Lisa walked up to the glass, knowing I could see through it.
Not very talkative, are you?
Her eyes unnaturally darted around in all directions, and her skin drooped a bit, almost as if it was falling off the bone. I didn't answer. She didn't speak again. Instead, she stared at the glass for a long time, long enough to leave me feeling truly unsettled. She then waltzed in and stopped at my side, raising her arm. I hoped she wouldn't notice that my breathing had become sporadic and labored. She then violently swung down on the desk, creating a thunderous clap. I almost winced, but held my composure. After another awkward 5 minutes or so, she left. I ran to the door and locked it behind her. A few moments later, there was yet another knock. This time it was a boy, claiming to be searching for his father. I let him in and sat back down. He tried many times to ask for my help, but I was careful to ignore him, just as I had with Lisa. At one point, however, I made the mistake of meeting his gaze. For an instant, in between blinks, his eyes became pitch black, void of all color. Startled, I nearly jolted back, but was able to restrain myself. Like Lisa before him, the boy eventually left, and I quickly locked the door behind him. Another rule followed. Other than the waste bin moving around a few times, nothing else happened that night. Before I knew it, it was time to go home. I heavily considered calling it quits, and may have even had a nightmare or two upon sleeping that day. But I found myself excited to continue, wondering what obstacles the room would throw at me next. Curiosity shouldn't have been enough to bring me back, but all rational trains of thought escaped me. The room had this pull that beckoned me to it. I was hopelessly compelled to return, powerless to its call. Any excuse would have sufficed. As such, I resumed my post the following night. Upon starting my shift, I was confident. I had dealt with quite a few absurdities up to this point, and waited patiently for my next opportunity. A couple of hours went by with no trouble. No cat, no images on the computers, no phone calls, and no waste bin antics. Boredom was beginning to set in when a loud knocking broke the silence. There was no voice. I yelled out from the overseer's room. "Who is it?" I asked. There was a brief pause.
It's me, Val.
I picked up the list and reread rule number 7. "What's the password?" I heard him chuckle to himself.
I never wrote down a password.
He was right. There was no password written with the rule. It must have been him. I cautiously made my way to the door and opened it. Al was there to greet me with a smile. I sighed in relief. "Let me guess, scared of the things that go bump in the night?" He laughed at my clear, nervous disposition. "You have no idea." He shut the door and set up some things at one of the computers. "Say, why didn't you write down a password?" I asked. He smiled again.
It's a ploy. Anyone posing as me might try to come up with one, which would identify them as not being me. Understand? I see. Good thinking.
He returned to work at his computer. I didn't want to bother him, but I just had to know. What is this place anyway? Why do these things happen here? He turned to face me. "It's best if you don't ask questions, especially ones that are far above your pay grade." I wasn't happy with my answer, but I knew it was all I could get out of him. I let him work in peace and sat back down in the overseer's room, watching through the one-way glass. That's when I realized something. The computer Al was using, it was Hank's. I double-checked the list to make sure. Yes, that was definitely Hank's desk. No one was to touch his computer. Didn't that apply to Al as well? I turned over the list on the off chance I might find more information. That's when my heart sank. In large, bold print on the back of the laminated sheet was text that read, "Password, Diner." I grabbed my phone, reached for the scrap of papers with Al's number on it, and dialed it as fast as I could. There was a few tones, but he finally picked up.
Hello? Everything all right over there?
"Al, thank goodness. I made a mistake. I thought he was you. I let him in, and now he's on Hank's computer." He let out a long sigh of disappointment. I watched as Al's copy turned from his computer and then stood up.
Listen very carefully. Do not act suspicious in any way. You should be fine if he doesn't suspect anything. If you try to leave or call anyone, it'll all be over, understand?
"Yes, I understand." Al's copy began walking to the overseer's room. My heart was beating faster than it ever had before.
I'll be there soon, just don't panic.
He hung up. I kept the phone to my ear as Al's copy approached, so as to pretend I was talking to my wife. "Yeah, I told you, hun, 6 o'clock. That's when I clock out. You don't have to wait up for me. You worry too much. Please, just get some sleep." Al's copy was in the room with me now, staring. I held the phone to my chest and looked back at him. "Everything okay?" I asked. He continued to stare for a few long seconds. "Can you help me with something on the computer?" I wondered if he could see my chest pounding. "Sure, I just need to finish this phone call. I'll be there as soon as I can." He stared for another moment and then walked back to Hank's desk. Though panicked, I kept up appearances by continuing to pretend I was on the phone. I even acted out an argument to lengthen the call. While doing this, I watched with bated breath as the knob gently turned and the door swung open. I had never been so relieved in my life. He turned to the glass and put a finger to his mouth, gesturing for me to keep quiet. The clone was not yet privy to his arrival. Al snuck up behind the clone and grabbed him by the throat. The imposter struggled but eventually succumbed to his vicious grip. He fell to the floor, a lifeless hull, before disintegrating into the carpet. I ran to Al and thanked him. I also apologized profusely. "No need to apologize. This isn't the first thing to make it into the room. I'm sure it won't be the last either. I'm just glad you're okay." He smiled. "Speaking of which, mind shutting the door? Wouldn't want another one of me stopping by." "Of course." I walked over to the door and then realized something. I had left it unlocked after the copy came in. That's how Al was able to enter. Remembering the final rule, I slowly pulled out my phone and opened the call log. My most recent call connected at 10:18 p.m., 13 minutes past the deadline. I turned around to see Al standing right behind me. "Al, what's the password?" He grinned. "What password?" I ran out of there as fast as I could. The room still has a strange hold over me, but I will never go back. At least, I hope I won't. I've talked about my road trip on this board before. Sick to death of working myself to death, I took the first vacation of my life last year. A beat-up, rebuilt Yamaha Zuma, and a foolish sense of optimism carried me across the western United States on an adventure that seriously made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the world. I loved Seattle, with the hip, original hippie neighborhoods and the perma-carnival atmosphere like Pike Place Market. The bridge troll was a highlight. Gotta love a city that sees a bridge and goes, "You know what this needs? A giant concrete troll." Getting out of Seattle, however, was a total nightmare. Restricted to back roads by a motor that capped at 40 miles an hour, I must have gotten lost a dozen times, despite all the help I received from baffled gas station attendants. So I was behind schedule when it came to finding my campsite. Some miles south and a little east of the city, there's a free campground. It's most often used by horse riders, and boy, you can smell it. That's actually what guided me in the last few miles. There's a gravel road off a service road, and then a few crooked, uneven paths off that. The trail markers were all bent and broken or faded. In the end, I had to follow my nose. I set up my junior scout tent in the fading twilight. Mine was the only one there. I had the place all to myself. After a quick meal of apples pilfered from a previous campground, I did my usual travel log spiel to my video camera by lantern light before turning in. I'm not sure how long I slept. I know I checked the time, but I'll be damned if I can recall what it was. Something had disturbed my well-earned beauty rest, but I was too groggy to remember what it had been. I sat in a stupor, too alert to fall back asleep, but too sleepy to be totally awake. Something brushed the side of my tent, and suddenly I was more awake than I'd ever been. I had done plenty of camping by that point. I was familiar with the sounds of the usual nighttime critters, from raccoons to coyotes. Nothing had ever bothered me in my tent before, just sniffed around camp before wandering off and leaving me be. From the sounds of the footsteps, it was walking on two legs. That was a first. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion: a bear. There's a lot of conflicting information out there about how to deal with bears, and a lot of it depends on the type of bear. Sitting there in the dark, with my heart beating in my throat, I had no way of telling which species I was dealing with. Shout out or play dead. I was 30 yards from a sturdy concrete block outhouse that might be better shelter. As quietly as I dared, I slipped my boots on and got ready to dash. The tent zipper seemed impossibly loud in the night as I worked it open centimeter by centimeter. I moved agonizingly slow. Once outside, I craned my neck around to see if the bear, if that's what it was between me and the outhouse. With the incredible illumination of the Milky Way, I could see the campground clearly all the way to the tree line. There was nothing out there. I could feel something watching me. It was like feeling an insect crawl along the back of my neck. There was no logical way for me to know something had its eyes on me, but out there in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, all alone, I couldn't dismiss it. Still on high alert, I crept along and tried not to crunch the gravel under my feet too loudly. The outhouse was still my best bet. The door was propped open by a stone, but inside there was a heavy-duty bolt lock. I would have to spend the night surrounded by the smell of not only horse, but also human poop, but I figured that was a fair trade for not getting mauled or eaten. My hand was on the latch when I heard the awful crunch of footsteps and gravel behind me. I kicked the stone, propping the door open out of the way, and slammed the heavy metal door shut, no longer caring how much noise I made. Whatever was on the other side had thumbs. Something tugged on the door as I struggled to bolt it shut. I won, but it was close. There was a metal mesh along the top of the structure for ventilation. Through it, I heard the bellows of heavy breathing that matched my own. My phone was back in my tent because I'm an idiot. There was no way to tell the time. The same stupid impulse that brought me out there in the first place kicked in. I had to know. Hello? Silence. Maybe they hadn't heard me, and then... Hello? I could have shit myself. I was in the right place for it. The voice was masculine like my own, and the sound of it was a kick to the gut. I couldn't even tell you why it made me so uneasy. The sensation was like when you're walking upstairs and you're expecting another step, but your foot comes down on empty space. I'm sorry, I thought I was alone, I said.
I'm alone.
Every syllable was jarring. I'm sorry I freaked out. I didn't think there was anyone else out here.
Sorry. I'm here.
You'd think now that I knew it was another camper, I would have opened the door, but I never did. Some deeply buried instinct in me kept me from taking my hand off the bolt. You scared the crap out of me. Are there more tent sites out there in the trees or something?
I'm something. There are more.
His words made me sick to my stomach. Again, I couldn't have even told you why, only that they did. From his odd syntax, I guessed English wasn't his first language. Do you need to go? Use the bathroom, I mean? Because I'm going to be in here for a while. That wasn't a lie. I wouldn't have opened that door if it was my own mother on the other side.
You need to go.
His grasp of English was improving with every sentence. There was something weird about that. Look, I'm sorry if I scared you, but you started it by creeping around in the dark. I won't come out. Can you go somewhere else? I'll be gone in the morning, I promise. I just wanted to sleep in peace.
You need to be gone. I promise you, I creep in the dark. You won't be here in the morning.
Fear cemented my mouth shut. The more I spoke, the more he did, and I didn't want to hear his voice anymore. I'm sure that makes me sound like a bigot or something, but I had the feeling I was feeding words to him, and the feeling was not pleasant. It felt like he was hungry for them. The same instinct that told me to keep quiet the first time kept me from running my dumb mouth off again. I was either dealing with someone who was not mentally well, or was something else entirely. There was a threat in his words, or the way he spoke them, and I had no doubt he would be able to carry out that threat. I kept my hands on the bolt while they cramped, and the first rays of sun crept sluggishly through the mesh at the top walls of my shelter. It wasn't until the sun was strong enough to make me sweat in my self-imposed prison that I felt brave, stupid, enough to speak again. Hello? Are you still out there? Hello? Anyone? There was no answer, which was the best outcome I could hope for. I opened the door. My tent was untouched, at least from a distance. The oppressive feeling of being watched had dissipated. I dressed and broke down camp in record time. My moped cranked to life, but it wasn't until I put on my helmet that I saw the footprint. I'd kicked that rock pretty far. It was close to my bike. Naturally, I went over to it. I had to know. In a clear outline of fresh mud, there was a single print on the smooth gray of the stone. Not human, but a hoof, like that of an unshod horse or goat. It was so fresh, so vivid. It hadn't been there last night when I used the bathroom before I'd gone to bed. In the soft mud in front of the outhouse door were more of the same, some on top of my own boot prints. If you want to go looking for whatever the hell it was, be my guest. Just be careful with your own words out there. Because I figured out what was wrong with that voice when I watched the playback of my travelogue video. It was my own. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed this story. This is a shorter one, but I thought it would be fun to do because I recently found this website where it will kind of like make an AI, like a bot that sounds like me. So I wanted to test out that program, so I used that program to make the little, like the voice of the creature. Obviously it doesn't sound completely human, but I thought it did sound a little bit like me, so I thought it'd be fun to use. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that video, and I hope you have a good weekend. If you liked the video, make sure to share it and all that jazz, and bye. Hey everybody, I hope you had a good New Year's. Before this video starts, I wanted to tell you all about the Chilling app, which is an app that I started working with a few months ago. It's a scary story app where you can listen to narrators like myself, Let's Read, Swamp Dweller, Mr. Creeps, Mr. Creepypasta's on there, and a bunch of others. With the app, you can listen to background ambience or just with the stories by themselves, and there are new stories being uploaded every month. I just recorded a few of them and they should be showing up on the app soon here. And if you have the app, I'd love to know what you think. With that said, I hope you have a great day and I hope you enjoy the story. The first time I caught the night bus was pure chance. I'd heard the legends, of course. We all had. Urban legends are a big thing where I live. I suspect it's partly because I hail from an unremarkable and frankly dull provincial city that has little else going on. Kids growing up around here don't have much to do, and so their imaginations tend to run wild, with escapism being all the rage. My friends and I were obsessed with urban legends during our formative years, gobbling up tales whispered in the playgrounds, and later posted by anonymous users on online forums. We found the legends both frightening and exhilarating, bringing excitement to our otherwise boring lives. It would be fair to say that I was quite naive back then. Some of my friends were more cynical, but I truly believed them all. The vanishing hitchhiker of Spencer Street, the Southside Trollman, and the White Lady of Croft Manor were a few of my favorites. My friends and I took on the role of amateur sleuths, investigating every site and searching for any evidence of these legendary cryptids and otherworldly entities. To my extreme disappointment, we found nothing, no ghosts or ghouls, no monsters, and no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, I too became cynical, concluding that all such legends were just childish nonsense, and I was wasting my time pursuing them. The last bus was another of the local myths that we'd heard growing up, and I'd assumed it was fake like all the others, but now I know better. Officially, the last bus out of the city center leaves at midnight from the bus depot on High Street. That's the bus which sensible people catch if they want to get home safely after a night out on the town. The pubs and clubs close at 1 a.m., and the crowd of drunken revelers pile onto the streets, fighting for taxis, lining up for late-night kebabs, attempting a last-minute hookup, or calling up friends in search of all-night house parties. It's the same chaotic scene every Friday and Saturday night. Usually, there are a couple of fights and a few people who will injure themselves by falling over drunk on the pavement. It's all depressingly predictable. The police will be called out, as will the ambulance crews, and eventually the crowds will disperse, as an eerie silence returns to the darkened streets. Then we enter the twilight hours, when all sensible and law-abiding citizens are at home, safely tucked up in their beds. After hours, the streets are left to the vulnerable, like the homeless with nowhere else to go, forced to seek shelter in shop door fronts, wrapping their cold bodies in old sleeping bags and praying that they make it through the night. Then there are the predators, the one that your mother warned you about, the gangs of thugs who patrol the streets, their blood up as they search for a victim to violently attack, and the predatory men who lurk in the shadows, watching for vulnerable women who they can prey upon. On a Monday morning, you'll read the stories in the local newspaper. The homeless man beaten to a pulp, the young girl sexually assaulted in a back alley. Police will open investigations and appeal for witnesses. Sometimes they'll catch the perpetrators, other times they won't. You'll have sympathy for the victims, but secretly feel relieved that it didn't happen to you or somebody you know. In these cases, the culprits are human monsters, made of flesh and bone, and not the otherworldly fiends I tried to chase. During my cynical years, I believed these human predators were the worst things out there, that they owned the twilight hours before the dawn, but I was wrong. There are far worse things that lurk in the shadows. The first occasion I caught the night bus came during a difficult time for me. I had just turned 21 and had split up with my partner of 2 years. Looking back, I now see how the breakup was the best thing for both of us, but at the time, I was devastated and so angry. My friends had taken me for a night out on the town in the hope it would cheer me up. A nice idea, but unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. I drank way too much, starting out on the beers and moving on to shots of hard liquor. We went to a club where I made several embarrassing and unsuccessful attempts to hook up. As if that wasn't bad enough, I then started a fight with my best friend, throwing a punch at him before I got thrown out of the club by the doorman and foolishly decided to walk the streets alone in a drunken stupor. I somehow managed to avoid getting beaten up or falling on my face and cracking my head on the pavement. Instead, I managed to stagger to a bus shelter, not realizing in my inebriated state that the official bus service had finished for the night, and there wouldn't be another one due until morning. I remember laying down to rest on the bench, and I must have passed out because I woke up several hours later and saw the streets were empty. I was all alone, or so I thought. My heart almost jumped out of my chest when I saw the old bus driving down the street towards me, emitting black smoke from its exhaust pipe as it came, its noisy engine interrupting the previous quiet. The vehicle was partially illuminated by the streetlights, although I noted with some concern how the lamps flickered as the bus drove by them. The vehicle looked like a throwback to the 1960s, the kind of ancient tin can on wheels you'd expect to see at a classic car show. Unlike the modern vehicles we're used to, those that glide along the street quietly, this old rust bucket rattled along, noisily looking as if it could break down at any moment, but instead, it kept coming, driving down the empty road and coming ever closer to my shelter. I noted how there were no emblems or motifs painted on the side of the bus, and no destination name was shown above its front windscreen. The vehicle's exterior was painted all in black, and even the windows were tinted, meaning I could not see who or what was inside. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I recalled the details I'd heard about the last bus legend, one of those I'd read and studied during my youth. The vehicle I was seeing before me matched the description of the one in the stories, the phantom bus that appears on an abandoned street in the early hours, offering rides to the weary and needy. I came close to panic in that moment, wondering whether I was dreaming or suffering a paranoid delusion. I'd spent so much of my youth chasing these legends, searching for any evidence that could prove the existence of something outside our own reality. But now that the truth was staring me in the face, a big part of me wanted to just up and run away. I couldn't tell if I was excited or terrified, but I held my ground and waited for the bus to come to me. I stood up on my shaking feet as the bus pulled in beside my shelter, and despite the amount of alcohol I'd consumed, I suddenly felt quite sober. It seemed to take forever for the vehicle to park and for the creaking door to swing open. When it did, I was confronted by a friendly middle-aged man wearing a neat blue uniform while he sat behind the wheel, driving his bus to an unspecified location. He smiled down at me, his eyes twinkling in a welcoming fashion. Then he opened his mouth and spoke in a soft, almost fatherly tone of voice, saying,
"Good evening, my friend. Are you coming on board?"
I'd heard about the enigmatic driver before, but nevertheless, his appearance and whole demeanor took me off guard. I struggled to find the words to respond, stuttering my way through my reply. Where will you take me?" I inquired nervously.
"Home."
The driver responded with a reassuring smile.
"I'll take you home. Eventually. But life isn't about the destination. It's about the journey. Sometimes you need to take a leap of faith. So what do you say, my young friend? Will you ride with us?"
I'll admit to being scared in that moment, terrified in fact. Somehow I realized how important this was, how the decision I made right then could shape the rest of my life. I didn't know exactly what would await me if I got on board, but I had a good idea, and it was terrifying. But if I walked away, I would never discover the truth. And so, I took a deep breath, plucked up my courage, and stepped onto the bus, seeing the driver smile as the door shut firmly behind me. When I saw the driver up close, I sensed something sinister about him and instantly started regretting my decision, but by then, it was too late. That was the first time I rode the night bus. Over the years, I've been on it 3 times in total, living to tell my tale on each occasion. Catching the phantom bus isn't as easy as you would imagine. There's no set of rules that you can follow, no set time or location. I don't know whether it's sheer chance or if the bus itself chooses the passengers. I have, however, been able to piece together common threads, using both my own experiences and those of others who've made the journey. We have an online forum which we use to tell our stories and exchange information. It's an issue of safety as much as anything else. The night bus can be lethal if you don't keep your wits about you. Having accumulated this knowledge over the number of years, I will now share it with you here. Once you step on board the bus, you'll see rows of hard-back seats stretching back to the rear of the vehicle's interior. There's nothing unusual about this, at least not at first glance. You'll see other passengers too, but you mustn't engage with them at this point. And don't look them in the eye. Take a seat on an empty bench somewhere toward the front of the bus. It doesn't really matter where exactly. They will come to you in their own time. The journey itself can last for hours, or at least that's what it will seem like when you're on board. You can see out the windows from the inside and look upon the scenery, such as it is. Initially, you will see familiar sights, city center streets, buildings, and businesses that you'll recognize. Nevertheless, you'll soon realize that something isn't quite right with the scene. The streets will be totally abandoned, with no traffic or pedestrians anywhere to be seen. There won't be any businesses open or lights emanating from anywhere along the road. The further you drive out from the city center, the more bizarre the sights you will encounter. Soon, the tidy streets and well-maintained buildings will give way to urban decay, crumbling structures and ruins like those of a lost city forgotten to time. Eventually, the bus will leave the city behind and enter what appears to be a dense forest. The narrow road you will follow will be shrouded in darkness, with the only illumination coming from the vehicle's bright headlights. If you glance into the woods on the other side of the road, you will occasionally catch a glimpse of shadows moving behind the tree line, strange figures and unidentified animals with glowing red eyes glaring through the darkness. You'll see these unnerving creatures for only the briefest of seconds as the bus drives through, and then they'll be gone. At first you'll think it's just your fertile imagination playing tricks on you, but deep down, you'll know that there's something evil lurking in those woods. By this point in the journey, it should become clear that you're no longer in the realm of the living. I don't know where the bus takes you, but I do know it is not wise to stare out the windows for too long. What lurks out there can drive you mad. And besides, your focus should be on those inside the bus, as they pose the more immediate threat. My fellow online sleuths and I think of the passengers as lost souls. It seems certain that they are no longer part of the world of the living. There's something lacking in them, an important piece that is missing. Once you talk to them, and they will engage with you, whether you want them to or not, you'll see the sadness in their empty, dead eyes. They'll want to latch onto you because you have what they want, life. That's why it's so important that you follow the rules. Don't let them get inside your head, whatever you do. There are 6 entities you're likely to encounter once you set foot upon the bus, all of whom have their own unique traits and tricks which they'll attempt to use against you. Based on the shared experiences of our forum members, I have pieced together a description of each of these otherworldly entities. Firstly, there's the driver, whose physical description I've already covered. The driver's first job is to get you on board. That's why he'll appear to be so friendly and welcoming, enticing you to take a ride on his bus. However, once the door shuts behind you and the bus starts moving, you'll see the driver's smile falter ever so slightly as he breaks eye contact and focuses on the road. Despite this, the driver is a benign figure who plays a small but important role in the events which follow. His job from this point forward is to simply drive, and he does keep his promise to you. He will bring you home, eventually, assuming you don't fall foul of any of the spirits during the drive. Like I said, the journey will seem to last for hours, but when he drops you off at your home street, back in our realm, no time will have passed whatsoever. He lets you off, smiling once again and saying, "Have a nice evening. Hope to see you again soon." And you'll be left standing on the pavement outside of your home, bewildered and in a state of shocked disbelief as you watch the phantom bus drive down the road, before it inexplicably vanishes at the end of your street. After the driver, the first passenger you're likely to notice is the party girl. This is an attractive young woman who appears to be in her early to mid-20s. Her physical appearance will change on each occasion. Sometimes her hair will be brunette and other times blonde. Likewise, her skin complexion can either be pale or dark depending upon the beholder. What's consistent is how she's made up and dressed. donning a cocktail dress and high heels and carrying a designer handbag. Her fragrance is sweet and enticing, but you may also smell a hint of alcohol on her breath. You'll note how her mascara has run, indicating she has been crying. Nevertheless, there is something in her deep and expressive eyes which will draw you in, an inner beauty and vulnerability that plays on your emotions. It's worth noting that you will be attracted to the young woman in spite of your gender or usual sexual preference. You'll be unable to take your eyes off her and will feel compelled to take a seat close to her. The party girl will engage you during the early stages of the journey, distracting you from the bizarre sights outside of the bus's windows. At first, she'll be flirtatious and fun, asking you about yourself and talking about her night out. But soon, the conversation will take on a darker tone, and the girl tells you about a tragic event from her past: childhood abuse, a violent ex-partner, or the death of a loved one. The story will vary each time, but will always be one of sadness and suffering. Your heart will go out to her, even if you're not usually an empathetic person. Once she's told you her woeful tale, the young woman will ask you to go home with her, to give her some comfort. You will be tempted, but under no circumstances should you agree to go with her. It's critical that you remember what she is and what she really wants from you. My advice is to politely decline her offer without causing her undue suffering. The party girl may be a lost soul, but by all accounts, she still feels human emotions. She won't be angry when you reject her, but instead will sob softly into her hands. You'll feel guilty, but you must move on and switch seats, leaving the poor girl to her misery. The next passenger you'll encounter sits a couple of rows behind the party girl. We call her the OAP, or the pensioner. She's an elderly woman in her 80s, her white hair in curls, wearing a shawl and a heavy winter coat, and with a shopping cart on wheels parked under her seat. Her face is wrinkled, and the perfume she wears is quite overbearing, but the OAP has kind eyes and a sweet motherly smile. She'll remind you of an elderly relative, like a grandmother or great aunt, and you'll feel an affection towards her. A woman of her age and appearance is the last person you'd expect to find riding a bus during the early hours of the morning, and yet, here she is, another lost soul trapped on a journey that never ends. The OAP will speak with you in a kindly, wholesome fashion, asking about your life and family, while also entertaining you with anecdotes from her long and interesting life. You truly will feel at ease talking with her, but you mustn't forget what she really is. The conversation will end with the woman asking you to accompany her home to help her with shopping or something like that. She'll offer to prepare you something to eat, your favorite meal or snack, whatever that may be, and she'll offer to put you up for the night. Again, you'll be tempted, but you must say no. On this occasion, it doesn't matter how politely you refuse her offer. Whatever you say or do, she will react with absolute fury, screaming every obscenity under the sun as her face screws up in anger. It's the last thing you would expect from a seemingly sweet old lady, but this is what will happen. As soon as she launches into her hateful tirade, you should leave your seat and move further down the bus, and you would be wise not to engage with her again for the rest of the journey. The next passenger you'll meet is a scruffy, middle-aged man known as the drunkard. He sits close to the back of the bus and is perhaps the type you would expect to find on a late-night service. I wouldn't recommend sitting too close to the drunkard, if only because he smells pretty bad, his breath stinking of alcohol and cigarettes. You'll note how his old clothes are soiled and torn, and his unkempt beard will be badly matted. You probably won't wish to engage with him, but the drunkard will begin a conversation with you regardless, and against your better judgment, you'll get drawn in. The drunkard will turn out to be surprisingly intelligent and insightful, seeking to educate you on such matters as religion, philosophy, and scientific theory. He'll tell you a story in the form of a parable or fable, one with a dark twist to it. When I first met the drunk, he recounted to me the tale of the frog and the scorpion, one that demonstrates the cruel and destructive nature of life. Next, he'll remove a silver hip flask from the inside of his jacket pocket and offer you a drink. Regardless of your alcoholic preferences, you'll be tempted to take a sip. The drink will smell sweet and inviting, but of course, you must refuse him. After you turn down the drink, the drunkard will shoot you an angry look before shaking his head and saying,
You're a damn fool, a stupid child. You have no idea what you're dealing with.
This is your cue to move on. Now, you'll notice how the first 3 passengers are trying to draw you in, using whatever charms or supernatural powers they have at their disposal. Their ultimate goal is to trick you into leaving the bus. Needless to say, you must not do this, not if you want to make it home. Nobody knows exactly what happens to those who fall into one of their traps. We do know that several members of our forum have vanished without a trace over the years, and my city has a long history of unexplained disappearances. The 4th passenger is different from the rest, however. He is a young male who sits on the back row whilst listening to headphones linked up to an 80s-style Walkman. We call him Headphones Guy, and it seems all he does is listen to music, his eyes closed as he taps his foot to the beat. The Headphones Guy will not attempt to engage with you or even acknowledge your presence. That's not to say he isn't dangerous, however. There was a member of our group who had a run-in with the guy. To be fair, it wasn't unprovoked. Feeling bold, my friend got right up in the passenger's face, waving his hands and clicking his fingers in an attempt to gain the spirit's attention. When this failed, he foolishly grabbed the guy's headphones, physically pulling them off his head. Predictably, the headphone guy didn't react well to this violation. In an instant, he jumped up from his chair, lashing out with his fist and knocking his assailant down in one punch. My friend remembers a sharp, intense pain in the back of his head before he blacked out. The next thing he remembers is waking up in his own bed the next morning with a broken nose and a nasty gash on the back of his head. He also found a note in his jeans pocket, crudely written on the back of an old bus ticket in what looked like dried blood. It read, "Do that again, I'll rip your head off." Unsurprisingly, my friend never rode the night bus again. I don't know what the headphone guy's deal is, but my advice is to leave him well alone. At this point, you're probably wondering why one would wish to catch the night bus at all, given how you'll be transported to a terrifying alternate reality and encounter otherworldly spirits who wish to trap you there. Well, the short answer is that no sane person would, bar a handful of crazed urban adventurers and amateur paranormal investigators such as myself. Most of us who have boarded the Phantom Bus have done so by accident, not realizing what they were getting themselves into until it was too late. And most of those who rode the bus once have no inclination to do so again. But those of us who do seek out the Phantom Bus for a second or third, or in my case, 4th occasion, well, we have our reasons. One reason, above all others in fact, we want to see the Harbinger and ask him our one permitted question. I'll regret my first ride on the bus for the rest of my days. Although I was drunk, I had enough wits about me to see off the various tricks used by the ghouls, but I wasn't prepared for him. The Harbinger is the only passenger who isn't already riding on the bus when you first get on. He comes later, after you've negotiated your way through the ghostly entities and you think the worst is behind you. The first thing you'll notice is the burning cross mounted on top of darkened hillside, overlooking the road on the left-hand side. I remember the first time I saw that foreboding symbol and the immense fear I felt, as I knew something was coming. A moment after I spotted the cross, I was shocked to see the bus was slowing down, pulling over to the side of the road and parking up in a lay-by. Next, the driver operated the swing door at the front of the bus, opening it to whatever lay on the other side. The terror almost overwhelmed me as I thought of the horrors that lurked within the Shadowlands, of the creatures and demons hiding in the haunted woods and hillsides. I recall looking to the other passengers, somehow hoping these devious spirits would offer me some protection from whatever was coming, but instead, their heads were down as they maintained a solemn silence. Realizing I was on my own, I glanced out the window to witness a sight which chilled me to the very bone. There was a small, covered shelter by the roadside, almost covered by overgrown vegetation and only just visible in the dim light, and within this seemingly abandoned bus shelter stood a tall, hooded figure, a sinister individual with his face covered and his considerable frame hidden underneath a long and dark robe. The mystery man remained still and silent, although I soon spotted the animal by his side, a large black dog that snarled aggressively through a snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. As it glared at me with hungry and predatory eyes, only a thin glass pane separating me from him. I imagined the hound breaking loose, ascending the steps and charging down the aisle before burying its razor-sharp fangs into my soft flesh. Thankfully, the dog's master retained control of his beast, although I was far from out of danger. I also noticed how hot and stifling it suddenly became, as an almost unbearable heat wave hit me. Meanwhile, the bus remained parked for what seemed like an eternity, its door ajar as the driver waited to see whether his passenger would get on. Now, I've since learned that the hooded figure we call the Harbinger will do one of two things at this point. Either he will remain rooted to the spot until eventually the driver will say something like,
Well, not tonight then.
before he closes the door and drives on. From what I've been able to gather from both my experiences and those of my contemporaries, this is what happens most of the time. 2 times out of 3, the Harbinger won't step out from the bus shelter, and that will be the end of it. But sometimes, he will step forward, marching through the mud in his heavy boots while dragging his hellhound along on a leash, and he'll come on board the bus, gliding down the aisle with his faithful mutt following behind him, prompting the driver to say,
Good evening, sir. I trust you'll have a pleasant journey.
The Harbinger will not answer. Instead, he'll take a seat near the front of the bus, pulling his hood down to reveal what lies underneath. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw in that terrifying moment. It seemed like there was only a dark void where his face should be, with 2 burning orbs instead of eyes. He had no mouth that I could see, and so by rights he shouldn't have been able to speak, and yet he did.
Come, sit with me.
He ordered.
Come sit with me so we may speak.
As you can imagine, I was utterly terrified in this moment, so much so that I thought I might pass out, but for reasons I can't explain, I obeyed the Harbinger's orders, feeling like I physically could not resist him, and as if my legs were no longer under my control. I remember looking to the other passengers as I walked down the aisle, hoping that one of them could help me, but each of the 4 kept their heads down as they muttered in unison, reciting a prayer in a language I could not understand. It became obvious that the Harbinger held power over these lost souls, and they were all trapped under his spell. Perhaps they were once like us, falling victim to the phantom bus and the Harbinger's godlike powers. In any event, they offered me no assistance in that fateful moment, and I soon realized I was completely at the Harbinger's mercy. I involuntarily took a seat in the row directly behind the Harbinger. His head turned in an unnatural way to face me as his dog snarled aggressively in my direction, but thankfully resisted the urge to bite me in the leg. I can't really describe how the Harbinger smelt, other than to say he stank of death. The fiery orbs he had instead of eyes stared right at me, and I couldn't look away no matter how much I tried. I felt like I was on fire, my soul burning under his hateful glare. In my state of abject terror, I imagined what this monster might do to me. I reckoned he could kill me with ease, but this was the least of my fears. Instead, I believed I may become like the others, another anonymous lost soul riding this damn bus for all eternity. In any event, I was powerless to do anything in that moment other than remain frozen to my seat, waiting for the Harbinger to speak. Despite his absence of eyes, somehow I could tell he was looking down on me, that he considered me with total contempt, like I was something he'd stepped on. To this day, I don't know whether he was speaking out loud or if his voice was only in my head. Either way, I found myself totally transfixed as he spoke his words.
I see another mere mortal has found its way into my realm.
He began. I assumed he was referring to me.
I'll confess to having little time for your contemptible and weak race. Nevertheless, I must respect the bravery of the odd individuals such as yourself. Not many have the courage to come to this dark place. For this reason, I will grant you safe passage, and I will answer your one question. Ask me what you will, and I will impart to you my infinite knowledge.
Now, this is a moment I've replayed over and over again in my head over the years. I literally could have asked the Harbinger anything. The winning lottery numbers, who killed JFK, the meaning of life. He sees and knows everything, and the possibilities are limitless. One of the guys on our forum asked the Harbinger how he would die and was told that his vices would kill him within 6 months. Well, this guy was an addict, but he laughed off the Harbinger's warning and continued using. 6 months later, he was dead from an overdose. And then there was a young woman who, at the time of her encounter with the Harbinger, was stuck in an abusive and controlling relationship. She asked the entity what would happen if she stayed with her asshole boyfriend. Well, she was told her life would end unless she broke off the relationship. This proved to be the motivation she needed to leave him, and about a year later, the bastard was arrested for murdering another girl and ultimately sentenced to life in prison. But of course, I didn't know any of this at the time. I felt nothing but pure terror as I sat frozen to my seat, quaking in my boots as the Harbinger glared down upon me with disgust. In that chilling moment, I could only think of one question to ask, which I stuttered out from my trembling lips. What are you?" I swore I could hear the creature scoff with contempt before he gave his answer.
My poor child. Alas, you humans will never fully comprehend what I am and what I represent. Nevertheless, I owe you an answer, and I shall explain in the simplest of terms. I am the past, the present, and the future. I see all from where I stand, and yet I have sworn not to intervene in the mortal realm.
He paused momentarily, turning his burning orbs toward the darkened landscape outside the window.
This world you see before me is my kingdom, my domain. I offer sanctuary to those who have nowhere else to go, giving a home to those lost souls trapped between the mortal and eternal realms. Perhaps you will come here one day and become a permanent resident of my dark realm, or perhaps not. You could have inquired after your ultimate fate, of course, but you chose not to do so. But I have answered your one permitted question and fulfilled my obligation. And now, my child, I will bid you farewell.
With that, he rose from his chair and summoned his hound, gliding down the aisle as he made for the exit. I was flabbergasted and in a state of shock. I still had so many questions to ask, and I opened my mouth without thinking. "Wait!" I called after him, instantly regretting my decision to speak. The Harbinger turned sharply, his orb-like eyes burning ever fiercer, his howl growling as it bared its sharp teeth, pulling on its lead as it tried to get at me. When the Harbinger spoke again, his tone became angry and threatening.
Heed my warning, you damn fool. I have tolerated your presence in my realm thus far. Do not test my patience. I can inflict pain upon you which goes beyond your worst nightmares. I will not hesitate to do so if you break my rules again.
I felt all the blood drain from my face, and my whole body shook uncontrollably as sheer terror overcame me. Needless to say, I did not utter another word. Instead, I watched on in shocked awe as the Harbinger glided down the aisle, dragging his snarling hellhound with him. The driver brought the bus to a slow halt to allow the godlike creature to disembark. I began to feel pangs of relief as I thought my ordeal was nearly over, but there was one last twist to his macabre episode. As the Harbinger stepped off the bus, my fellow passengers suddenly shot up from their seats, all simultaneously turning in my direction. To my horror, I saw their eyes had turned jet black and their mouths were wide open, revealing gaping black holes. It seemed like they were trying to scream and yet no sound was emitted. And then I saw what was lurking in the darkened woods on the other side of the road. Hundreds of fiery red eyes emerging from the tree line, belonging to unholy beasts that howled like wolves in the night, every one focused upon our bus. I screamed out in terror, fearing that the Harbinger had changed his mind and was summoning his hellish minions to tear me apart. The howling rapidly increased, becoming so loud that I was nearly deafened. What happened next remains something of a blur in my memory. I recall the horrific din and the pressure built up inside my head until I thought my skull would explode. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, forcing me to hide my eyes underneath my hands. A moment later, I opened my eyes again, only to discover that the beast had vanished, as had my ghoulish fellow passengers. I was the only one inside the bus, just me and the driver, as we continued down that lonely stretch of road. I have very little recollection of the rest of the journey. I don't think it was much longer before we left the dark realm and returned to the city streets I knew and recognized. When we arrived on my home street, I could not believe it, thinking it was another trick. I sat still in my seat for some time until eventually I needed to be prompted by the driver, who called out to me, saying,
Your stop, my friend. Come on now, please. I can't wait here all night.
With some trepidation, I walked down the aisle and stepped off the bus, feeling the cool, fresh air against my skin as I returned to the realm of the living. I recall the driver wishing me a good night, saying he would see me again before he drove away. So that's my story, but it's not quite the end of it. You may well ask why I didn't abandon my obsession with the phantom bus after my terrifying encounter. Well, for a long time I did, but in the end my curiosity got the better of me. I don't like the uncertainty of life, of not knowing what lays before me. I used to think that's just the way it is, but now I know better. The Harbinger is out there, and he can provide the answers I need. I won't waste my opportunity a second time. For years I have chased the bus, and I've caught it a further 2 times. On both occasions, I boarded and avoided the traps set by the ghoulish passengers, and both times I waited for the Harbinger to board, but he would not move from his shelter, and so my hopes were frustrated. It's been extremely disheartening, but I will not give up. Tonight I will seek out the bus once again. I will keep doing so until the Harbinger answers my call. I know the risks. One night I may board the phantom bus and never make it home, but nevertheless, I need to do this. I must know the truth, no matter what the cost. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a bus to catch. The following transcript is taken from a Garda missing persons report, dated December 5th, 2020. The subject's name is Paul O'Shea, age 32. Mr. O'Shea is, or was, a mature PhD student at the School of Irish History in Waterford Institute. A Waterford native, Mr. O'Shea has been traveling back and forth to the north whilst researching for his thesis, entitled The Cultural Impact of the Northern Irish Troubles, 1969 to 1998. Due to COVID restrictions, he's been self-isolating at a small, rented cottage in Kilkenny County. His family and friends stated how Mr. O'Shea welcomed the opportunity to work at a quiet location and said he had a considerable amount of material to catalog and analyze. He was reported missing by his mother after repeated calls went unanswered. Garda officers attending the scene found evidence of foul play and suspected an abduction. However, there are no witnesses forthcoming and no evidence of where he was taken or who took him. An audio file was found on Mr. O'Shea's laptop, which was deemed relevant to the case. This recording will be shared here to shine a light on the police cover-up and to provide a warning to others who may foolishly consider following Mr. O'Shea's example.
November 22nd. My voluntary self-isolation begins today. I plan to commit the next fortnight to my work, and I hope to have finished the first draft of this section by the time I emerge. My rented cottage is basic and isolated, but has a fairly serviceable Wi-Fi connection, which should meet my requirements. My current area of research is paramilitary propaganda videos from the late 1980s and early 1990s. A key period of the conflict,
that saw a final flurry of violence prior to the paramilitary ceasefire of 1994. As I've previously stated in my introduction, the Northern Irish Troubles was one of the most comprehensively covered conflicts during the latter half of the 20th century. To a significant extent, this is due to cultural bias and perhaps an unconscious racism. After all, the Troubles was a conflict that occurred in the Western world, and all the participants were white and spoke English. That said, the media coverage and academic studies of the conflict differ significantly from the material produced or authorized by the paramilitary groups themselves. The latter can broadly be categorized as propaganda, although the same label could be applied to much of the output of the British and Irish governments of the time. Nevertheless, paramilitary groups operating during the Troubles were evidently interested in their public image and sought to demonstrate how they were fighting a just war rather than raging terrorist campaigns. This is particularly true of the Provisional IRA and of other Republican groups who wish to depict themselves as freedom fighters. Over the coming days, I will be reviewing multiple films and clips from this period and recording my initial thoughts before I conduct a more detailed analysis. November 23rd. I scrolled through dozens of videos and watched about 10 hours of footage today. Much of it was generic material relating to news reports, stock footage of riots, the aftermath of bombings, etc. Other scenes are clearly staged but nevertheless of interest. Firing parties at funerals and masked gunmen arriving at street rallies are common fare. There's a Robin Hood-type feel to many of these videos, with masked rebels holding aloft smuggled Kalashnikovs as an act of open defiance against the authorities. Some of the footage has a surreal edge to it. For example, one clip shows an IRA unit entering a social club in West Belfast. Clearly, the drinking den is frequented by Republican supporters, as the armed men are enthusiastically applauded as they make their way to the stage. One man spoke into the microphone whilst holding a revolver in his other hand, reading a statement on behalf of the battalion staff. The statement was predictably mundane and cliched. What struck me, however, was how nervous the young masked man seemed. He was visibly shaking as he stuttered his way through the reading. It was unclear whether he feared arrest or was simply frightened of public speaking. In any event, I think I've covered enough for one day. Time to rest up and start afresh tomorrow morning. November 24th. Another day spent in front of a screen. Much of the footage I've reviewed is dull and tedious, but certain pieces stand out. Relatively well known is a documentary entitled The IRA Speaks, filmed by a French production company in 1992. The film includes a number of notable scenes. In one, an IRA unit patrols a housing estate in Derry City. Masked men with assault rifles move in military-style formation, taking cover behind garden walls and letterboxes as they scan the area with their guns. There was a moment of dark comedy when the armed men encounter two elderly women walking down the street with their shopping. The women are clearly unimpressed by the display of bravado. One of the women mutters, "Ah, for goodness sake," while her companion shakes her head in tuts. The next scene is set in a rural area, presumably somewhere along the border. On this occasion, the IRA have set up a checkpoint along a narrow stretch of country road. They hide in hedgerows by the roadside until a car comes into view. One man steps forward, signaling for the vehicle to stop, while the rest of the unit covers the road with their guns. The gunmen are polite and civil to the drivers, asking to see their identification and inquiring where they are traveling to. One middle-aged woman says she is going home to make dinner for her family and is allowed to proceed. There is a cargo cult element to these staged scenes. The IRA are replicating the behaviors of the British Army, carrying out patrols and manning roadblocks. Their aim here is to demonstrate legitimacy. This afternoon, I spent some time on an internet forum discussing rare or lost footage from this period. I got to chatting with a user calling himself Captain Black. He claims to be in possession of a digitized video showing the aftermath of an IRA attack from the early 1990s. This isn't strictly what I'm looking for, but it does sound interesting. My university email address is public knowledge anyway, so I see little harm in sharing it with this user. He has agreed to forward me the video in a zip folder. I await his response. November 25th. I received the file last night and watched it first thing this morning. The converted video was just over 5 minutes long and entitled Aftermath of SAS Ambush in Tyrone County. As it transpired, the footage was taken by the security forces and apparently leaked. What it showed was the bloody aftermath of a counterinsurgency operation undertaken by the elite Special Air Service. The video opened with a long-range shot of a bullet-ridden lorry in a car park. A heavy machine gun was physically attached to the rear of the vehicle, indicating that the lorry had been used in an IRA attack. The cameraman slowly moved closer to the vehicle to reveal a gruesome scene. The driver was still in the cab, having been shot multiple times at close range, with fragments of his skull and brain splattered across the cab's interior. The cameraman focused on the dead man for a moment, zooming in to emphasize his grotesque head wounds. Then he moved, slowly walking alongside the truck whilst continuing to film. There were 2 bodies located at the rear of the vehicle, close to the machine gun. Both were riddled with bullets and also had severe head wounds, possibly caused by coup de grace style close-range executions. They both looked young. Once again, the cameraman lingered over the gruesome scene. There was blood everywhere. Next, he walked across the car park to reveal a 4th corpse. This man had apparently tried to flee from the scene and was shot multiple times in the back. I closed the video at this point and vowed never to watch it again. The bloody carnage left me feeling ill. Effectively, I just viewed a snuff video, and watching it made me feel like an accessory to a vile crime. I completed some research and linked the footage to a botched IRA operation in rural Tyrone County in the early 1990s, which resulted in the deaths of 4 IRA members at the hands of the SAS. The footage was originally filmed by the security forces as part of their investigation, but at some point, the video was leaked and copies found their way into loyalist circles, and eventually a digitized version ended up online. Obviously, this isn't the type of material I'm looking for in support of my thesis. Arguably, it has some merit from an academic point of view, but emotionally, I cannot deal with such visceral and voyeuristic footage. I don't wish to offend my anonymous donor, and so I sent a polite reply email, thanking him for the video, but explaining what sort of material I'm looking for to further my research. In the meantime, I will return to my work. November 25th. I received a response from Captain Black. His tone was apologetic. He seemed genuinely sorry that the post-ambush footage wasn't helpful to my work. He also mentioned a second video that he is keen to share with me. Apparently, the footage is extremely rare and relates to an obscure splinter group called the Irish Revolutionary Guard. The IRG was a small but extremely violent paramilitary group that was active in the late 80s and early 90s, before subsequently disbanding. Several of its members were killed in an internal feud, while others were arrested and jailed. However, one of the IRG cells disappeared without a trace in 1990. They were all wanted men, and the theory was that they'd gone on the run, possibly fleeing to America. There were conspiracy theories, mainly relating to covert action by British Special Forces, but there was no evidence and the men never re-emerged. Captain Black claimed to have a paramilitary-style training video from that era, one that's never seen the light of day before. Interestingly, he claimed the footage was filmed right here in Kilkenny. I found this unusual, but not impossible. Republican paramilitaries carried out their war in the north, but they used the Irish Republic's territory to recruit and train members, store arms and explosives, and conduct fundraising operations, including armed robberies. I'll admit that I was intrigued. I knew I should be cautious, given the gory footage I'd already received from this source, but the prospect of viewing and archiving a previously unseen video was just too tempting. Therefore, I replied to Captain Black and asked him to send me the file. I await his response. November 26th. I got the email around midnight, having stayed up late in anticipation of receiving the material. I felt a burst of adrenaline when the message popped up in my inbox, my hand shaking as I clicked on my mouse to open the file. The video was much larger in size and duration than the previous file, with a runtime of over 20 minutes. I thought the previous film was grim, but it has nothing compared to this. The gore and violence were taken to a whole new level. I felt sick after watching it through to the end. Thankfully, this video is certainly a fake, albeit a scarily realistic one. Let me see if I can describe it. The film begins during daylight in a remote rural area. 3 paramilitary members can be seen marching through a rock-strewn field. All are wearing combat jackets and jeans, and have their faces covered by black balaclavas. They're also armed with assault rifles, which I recognize from my previous research. 2 of the gunmen held AK-47s, the infamous Russian weapon used in dozens of conflicts across the globe. The 3rd man carried an American M16 rifle. The armed trio marched toward the camera, projecting an image of strength and defiance. Next, they took up firing positions, laying along the grass and balancing their rifles against an overturned log whilst shooting at an unseen target in the distance. After the target practice, one of the masked men, presumably the commander, spoke to the camera in a broad Belfast accent, spouting a verbal diatribe against the Brits, speaking at length about the right of the Irish people to violently resist colonialism, and threatening various members of the government and security forces who the IRG regarded as legitimate targets. It was all pretty standard stuff for the era. They're followed by a sudden break in the film as the screen cut to black. I thought the video had finished, but noted there were still almost 10 minutes left to play. The picture returned after a couple of seconds, except now they were filming at night, with the scene dimly illuminated by a light on the camera as the same trio of gunmen patrolled through a wooded area underneath a full moon. There was something different about this scene, which I should have recognized immediately. The film itself looked genuine, grainy, and with the colors slightly off, as one would expect from a home video recorded in the early 90s. This part of the fraud appeared seamless, at least to my untrained eye. There was, however, a noticeable change in atmosphere. The paramilitaries seemed to be on edge. The 3 gunmen no longer appeared confident or full of bravado. Now they walked with nervous apprehension, taking care with every footstep and flinching at every small sound around them. Even the cameraman appeared affected by the change in mood, as his hands were noticeably shaking as he filmed. The scene was reminiscent of a horror movie, which of course made perfect sense when I watched it to the end. As they marched, there was an audible snapping sound from somewhere in the background, a cracked branch or a small tree falling, perhaps. The on-edge paramilitaries reacted with fear to the sudden noise, jumping up and raising their weapons whilst they frantically searched the dark tree line.
What the fuck was that?
One man exclaimed.
SAS?
Another replied fearfully.
Calm the fuck down,
answered the 3rd man. I recognized the voice, identifying him as the commander who'd read the statement earlier in the video.
The SAS don't operate down here in the south. It's probably just a deer. What if it's the guards?
Asked one of his men. He was referring to the Garda, the Republic of Ireland's police force. The commander answered in a cold tone.
If it's the guards, we evade. Unless they corner us and try to make arrests, if that happens, let the bastards have it.
I felt a chill run through me when I heard those words. To hear how easily these violent men would consider murdering police officers. The next development was unexpected. A loud and piercing howl reverberated through my laptop speakers, making me jump. The paramilitaries nearly lost the plot when they heard the howl, which was closely followed by another, even deeper and more prolonged.
Jesus Christ, that was no fucking deer. Calm yourself.
the commander exclaimed.
It's a farmer's hound or something.
But he didn't sound so certain this time, as I could hear the anxiety in his voice. The tension was almost unbearable at this point. The patrol had halted, and the gunmen all knelt down on one knee, aiming their rifles in the direction the howling sound had come from. The cameraman obviously kept on filming, but he was shaking almost uncontrollably now, as he struggled to focus on the scene before him. There followed a moment of tense silence, a calm before the storm, before all hell broke loose. There was a mighty crashing sound from behind the trees, surely caused by something huge charging through the undergrowth, and a blood-curdling growl, so piercing it chilled my bones. Screamed one of the paramilitaries. He didn't get a chance to finish his curse, as a split second later something huge and vicious tore through the undergrowth, moving so fast it appeared to be a blur of muscle, fur, and teeth. The beast threw itself on top of its victim, rapidly slicing the helpless man's throat with its razor-sharp claws. The dying man let out a sickening death rattle as his blood was sprayed in all directions.
Jesus!
Screamed the commander as he raised his rifle and prepared to open fire. He managed to get off a single round without properly aiming, firing high and wide, but the beast was too fast, lashing out and knocking the gun out of his hands before biting the man's right arm clean off, literally ripping it from the socket. The commander screamed in complete agony, clutching at his bloody stump as he fell. The beast rapidly leapt on top of him, viciously clawing at his chest until he stopped moving. The third gunman remained perfectly still throughout, apparently frozen in shock and fear. He came back to reality too late, dropping his rifle and attempting to flee. He didn't get far as the beast tore across the open ground on all fours, biting deeply into the man's exposed throat. He was soon dead. Amazingly, the cameraman had continued to film this entire gore fest, perhaps believing the camera offered him some sort of protection from the violent events playing out before him. But now, with all the gunmen dead, he woke up to the danger and started to run. He didn't drop his camera, and it continued to record, showing shaky footage of a frantic pursuit through a darkened forest. The cameraman's panicked breathing is clearly audible, along with the bloodthirsty growl of the beast as it chased him through the woods, closing in for the kill. Predictably, the cameraman didn't get away. Suddenly, the beast was in front of him, blocking his path. The cornered man raised his camera in a panic, shining the light to illuminate his attacker. At this point, I saw the beast clearly for the first time. Basically, it was a werewolf, a humanoid covered in gray and now blood-splattered fur. Its body was muscular and powerful. It stood on two legs now, its front legs, or arms, protruding with long razor-sharp claws ready to slash. The head was that of a wolf, however, its snout filled with huge teeth, and with fresh blood pouring from its mouth. The eyes were unlike any animal I've ever seen, glowing a bright red like those of a demonic entity. Its glare was terrifying, awakening a terror inside me that I hadn't felt since I was a child. The wolfman stood there for several seconds, staring down the cameraman who appeared to be frozen to the spot with fear. The beast seemed to be taunting his victim, but it wasn't long before it pounced, taking off on its powerful hind legs and knocking the man off his feet. The camera was knocked out of his hands, falling down to the forest floor. I heard a desperate scream and the terrible sound of ripping and tearing. Mercifully, these awful sounds soon stopped. There followed a moment of relative calm, with the camera showing nothing but leaf-covered foliage and the trees beyond. I hoped this was the end of it, noticing how there was only 30 seconds left to play on the video. But, of course, there was one last twist to play. Suddenly, the wolf's hideous face appeared on screen as it snarled into the camera, making me literally jump out of my chair. The horrifying beast remained on screen for more than 10 seconds, snarling viciously, with its long snout brushing against the camera lens, its jaw dripping with dark blood and red eyes glaring with menacing intent. It seemed like the beast was looking straight at me, its frightening gaze fixed upon me like I was to be its next victim, This was impossible, of course, but in that moment, I did feel truly scared. But then, mercifully, the video cut to black. The video was extremely unsettling, but it was, of course, a fake. Wolves have not lived in the wilds of Ireland since the late 18th century, and I know for a fact there is no creature like this living anywhere in the world. I'll confess that the film was very realistic and well made. I suspect this clip may be some sort of viral marketing scheme for a new horror movie or series. I feel stupid to have been taken in by such an obvious hoax. I'm also very angry with my contact, the mysterious Captain Black, who presumably sent me this as a sick joke. I stayed up late to type Captain Black a strongly worded email, stating in no uncertain terms how unimpressed I was and how I didn't appreciate my time being wasted in such a childish manner. I sent the email, but soon received a bounce-back message stating that the email address no longer existed. Finding this odd, I returned to the chat forum where I'd first made contact with this individual, only to discover all posts made by Captain Black had been removed, and his user account deleted. I was concerned by this point, fearing I'd fallen victim to an online scam and that the files I received and opened may contain viruses. Therefore, I quickly deleted both video files and ran a scan using my antivirus software. Thankfully, the scan brought up nothing. Nevertheless, I'll need to report the breach to the university's IT department, which will be embarrassing. I still can't believe I was taken in by such an obvious trick. Still, I'll need to put this incident behind me and get back to my work, starting tomorrow. November 28th. I didn't sleep a wink last night. It's an odd thing, but I couldn't get that damned video out of my mind. I'm not usually the squeamish type, but this short film really got under my skin. It was so damn realistic. I can't forget about that bloody wolf. Every time I close my eyes, I see its face, its snout dripping with blood, and its predatory eyes, hungry for death. It hadn't occurred to me before, but I'm very isolated out here. My rented cottage is 5 miles from the nearest village, and the next farm is at least 1.5 miles away as the crow flies. When night falls, the darkness is all-encompassing. From my front window, I can see the darkened tree line of a forest 1/4 mile to the north, and it reminds me of the hideous events in that damn film. The woods at night, the stuff of primal fears, imprinted into our DNA. It hadn't bothered me previously, but now I can't stop my imagination from running away with me. I kept the light on in my bedroom last night, something I haven't done since I was a kid. I'm ashamed to admit that I hid under my covers, shaking at every slight noise and creak, and experiencing a great relief when I saw the first light of dawn. I got very little work done today, as I found it impossible to focus. What the hell is wrong with me? Perhaps I've burnt myself out. I have been working very hard recently, and I need to rest. A good night's sleep is essential. But I'm dreading nightfall. To think of that darkened tree line, of who or what could be lurking in the shadows. Damn it, I need to get a grip. I'm a grown man, well-educated and rational-minded. No more of these childish superstitions. November 28th. It's 3 a.m. I was asleep but got abruptly awoken. I can hear howling, fucking howling. It's somewhere in the distance, but not too far away. Is someone screwing with me? Captain Black, or whoever the hell he is, playing a sick practical joke? A moment ago, I crept to the bedroom window and peeked through the curtains. The scene outside is partially illuminated by the moon, but nevertheless, I can see little. But then, I heard the howl again, louder this time. Shit, what is happening? Just to reiterate, there are no wild wolves left in Ireland. The last one was hunted down in the 1780s, for God's sake. The most dangerous predators we have are foxes, and it sure as hell isn't a fox making that noise. It could be a dog, I guess, but I hear it again, even louder this time. This is ridiculous. Obviously, someone is playing an elaborate prank on me. Bored locals with nothing better to do with their time. But I won't rise to the bait. I've decided to put my earplugs in, ignore the god-awful din, and try to get some sleep. Hopefully, the pranksters will get the message and leave me alone. Fingers crossed everything will get back to normal tomorrow. I awoke after dawn with my earplugs still in, having at least managed to get a few hours sleep. I did experience disturbing and vivid nightmares, however, images of that dreadful film of men being torn limb from limb. Nevertheless, I felt pleased with myself, thinking I had gotten the better of the pranksters. That is, until I came downstairs and opened the front door. There was a terrible smell, you see, something similar to rotting meat. I caught a whiff of it when I came downstairs and realized the stench was coming from outside. What I discovered on the other side of the door was a revolting sight. A pile of raw flesh, intestines, assorted internal organs, and God knows what else. These were the innards of at least one animal, and probably more than one. I retched at the sight, and the awful stench filled up my nostrils. Acidic bile forced its way up my throat. I was actually sick all over the doorstep. When I regained my senses, I soon determined that the bloody pile of organs had been purposefully placed right outside my door. Beyond the gross display lay a series of bloody paw prints, big ones, heading back towards the woods to the north. This has gone too far. I tried to ignore the miscreants in hopes that they would get bored and move on, but this latest stunt crossed the line, leaving me with no choice but to notify the authorities. Not that it's done me much good. I did phone the police this morning, but they were very unhelpful, and I got the distinct impression they didn't believe me, particularly when I described the howling noises emanating from the forest and the gory present left on my doorstep. They told me that it was likely a fox. I scoffed at the suggestion and insisted they send an officer to investigate. The dispatcher was evasive, however, stating that the nearest station was 45 minutes away from my location, and the force is stretched thin with enforcing COVID restrictions. It was left that they would send someone out when available. I waited hours, but eventually could not bear the stench in sight any longer, and I used a spade from the garden shed to scoop up the guts before burying the remains in the back garden. I felt better when this was done. Perhaps I was overreacting. Still, as the day goes on, I feel increasingly anxious about the prospect of spending another night here. I'm still convinced this is a hoax, but what I cannot understand is the connection between the video I received and whatever is occurring outside my rented cottage after dark. Surely it can't all be a coincidence, can it? There was little chance of me getting any serious work done today, and so, against my better judgment, I began to search the topic of Irish werewolves. What I discovered was disconcerting. My web search brought me to a site recording the history of Ossory, a medieval Gaelic kingdom which existed from the 1st century AD right up until the Norman invasion of Ireland during the 12th century. The territory of this ancient kingdom included Kilkenny County and parts of Louth County. Basically, this meant my little holiday cottage was right in the middle of what had once been Ossory. Being a history student, I already had some knowledge of the ancient Gaelic kingdoms, even though this wasn't my area of specialism. What I didn't know about, however, was the legend of the werewolves of Ossory. As I've previously stated, wolves are long since extinct in Ireland, but the island was once plagued by roving packs, and they were a serious enough threat that the Irish wolfhound was bred to hunt them. Wolf attacks on isolated farms and livestock continued at least up until the 1700s. Added to the mix were the Fianna warriors, ferocious mercenaries who roamed the countryside whilst wearing wolfskins and sporting lupin hairstyles. The legends of this era likely originated from these tales and became confused over the centuries. Nevertheless, there were numerous accounts of the Ossory werewolves throughout the Middle Ages in Irish, English, and Norse works. One story in particular captured my attention, however, sending a cold chill down my spine when I read it. The story was allegedly told by a priest who had been traveling from Ulster in the north to Waterford on Ireland's southern coast sometime during the 9th century. One night, he was traveling alone through a darkened forest within the borders of Ossory and encountered a hideous creature, half man and half wolf. The monster stood on 2 legs, blocking his path through the wood. To the priest's surprise, the creature spoke to him in the Gaelic tongue, describing how he'd once been a man but had committed heinous crimes against the innocent. As a punishment, he was cursed by a warlock chieftain and magically transformed into his current state, part man, part beast. What's more, the wretched creature's soul was trapped for all eternity between this world and the next, with the warlock's curse condemning him to return to these lands in a physical form once every generation, so he could hunt during the cycle of the moon. Having told his story, the beast is said to have advanced upon the priest with its claws unsheathed, determined to make him his latest victim. However, the holy man remained steadfast, standing his ground and raising his wooden crucifix whilst reciting the Lord's Prayer, thus forcing the unholy creature to retreat. As I dug deeper, I discovered websites run by so-called cryptozoologists and demonologists. These people claim to have traced the history of this legendary beast, pointing to numerous stories recorded over the course of centuries, tales of unidentified creatures roaming the lands, slaughtered livestock, and unexplained disappearances of both children and adults. What apparently links these incidents is that they all occurred at 30-year intervals, or once per generation. And the most recent incident that these online sleuths had linked to the legend was the mysterious disappearance of the Republican paramilitaries in this area in late 1990, almost exactly 30 years to this day. I felt a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach when I finished reading the last line. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if there could be some truth to this legend, given all I'd heard and seen over the past 36 hours. Had my watchings of that lost video unleashed an ancient curse, making me the target of this supernatural beast? For a while, I actually feared this was the case, and I did consider packing up my car and getting the hell out of there. Luckily, I've had a few hours now to think things over and regain my senses. I'm an academic, a man of logic and scientific reasoning. It's ridiculous for me to even consider such superstitious nonsense. Yes, there have been incidents, and on the surface they do appear to be linked to this local legend, but this means nothing. Clearly, the pranksters are aware of the werewolf legend and have concocted this elaborate hoax to scare me. Granted, it's a lot of work to go through, but I guess there's little else to keep the locals occupied during the times of lockdown. In any event, I still have a week's lease left on this cottage and have no intention of being driven out on account of such childish antics. I'm going to put an end to this nonsense, one way or another. November 29th. It's 3 a.m. and they've started up again. The howling is louder even than last night. A few minutes ago, I looked out my bedroom window, noting the clear night sky and bright moonlight. I spotted a figure moving amongst the trees, a dark shadow, but it was definitely somebody. I have considered calling the police, but they were less than helpful last time. Besides, by the time they get here, the pranksters will likely be long gone. I'm going out to confront them. I'll take the shovel to defend myself with, and will use the torch function on my phone. With any luck, I'll catch one of the bastards red-handed. God in heaven, it's real. The beast, it's real. I was marching back towards the tree line and saw it coming at me, running on all fours. It all happened so fast. It jumped me, slashing with its claws. Somehow, I managed to strike it with the shovel, and I hit the creature, buying myself some time. I don't know how, but I made it back to the cottage, slamming and locking the front door behind me. I can't believe this is happening. Am I dreaming? Jesus, I'm bleeding. The fucker scratched my chest from nipple to nipple. What'll I do? Who the hell can I call? Fuck, I dropped my phone during the fight. I'm cut off. Totally on my own. Why didn't I take this seriously? I'm a damn fool. I can hear it roaming outside. can see its dark figure through the windows. That low growl it makes as it searches for a way in. What the hell is it doing now? Jesus, it's attacking my car. It's slashing the tires and tearing up the engine. This thing is intelligent. It knows the car will be my last chance of escape. Now I'm trapped. I have a kitchen knife to defend myself with. That's all. It's gonna get in. I can hear it trying the back door. Did I lock it? Fuck. If anyone finds this recording, please tell... Oh my god! No, please! The Garda have refused to officially release this recording, but it was leaked by an anonymous civil servant who wishes to alert the public, along with details on what the investigating officers discovered at the scene. Mr. O'Shea's vehicle had been severely damaged as he described on the recording. There was evidence of a forced entry at the rear entrance of the cottage and a struggle in the kitchen. There were also dried bloodstains found on the kitchen floor, but no body and no signs of Mr. O'Shea. He is still officially listed as missing. Experts brought in say the scene is consistent with an animal attack, but of course there are no predators native to Ireland that can take down a fully grown adult man. The laptop was found undamaged, and this audio recording recovered. No trace was found of the video Mr. O'Shea described watching, and even when specialist software was used, the police were unable to recover the deleted files. It seems the Garda have no clue what happened to Mr. O'Shea, and they have no leads. So why have we shared the story on this platform? This is a warning. Anonymous posters on various forums are still trying to push the lost paramilitary tape on unsuspecting persons. If you are contacted by Captain Jack or any other user offering to send you such a video, do not provide any of your contact details, and if you do receive this video unsolicited, do not open it. We don't know for sure what the connection is between this film and whatever ancient curse it conjures, but Mr. O'Shea didn't take the threat seriously, and it cost him his life. Do not make the same mistake.
Due to the overwhelming number of requests I have received to tell about my discoveries and bizarre experiences in a cave not far from my home, I have created a webpage. I will outline the events that happened to me during the past few months, beginning with my journey into a familiar cave in December of 2000, and ending, well, it hasn't actually ended yet. I will use my caving journals as the text to tell about my recent experience, and I will give them to you as I experience them in chronological order. I have included photographs that were taken during many trips into the cave. I have also created a few illustrations to help the listener get a better idea of what things look like in the cave. All the photos were taken by me or one of the few people I went into the cave with. I want to point out a few things before I tell about the events. 1. Most of the pictures were taken with a Kodak disposable type camera. I took a better camera into the cave on 1 or 2 of the trips. Pictures on this site are all original photos and have not been messed with or enhanced, other than where noted. As a rule, I get my pictures put onto disk at the time of developing, so I don't have to scan them later. This ensures the best digital quality. 2. I will not reveal the names of the other people involved in this experience. If you know me well enough, you probably know them already. 3. I will not reveal the location of the cave to anyone for any reason, so please don't ask. I refuse to be held accountable for anyone's life but my own. I will refer to the cave as Mystery Cave. That is not its real name. If you think these events sound far-fetched, I agree. I would come to the same conclusion had I not experienced them. Ted.
(12/30/2000). B and I decided to get in one more caving trip before the new year, so we set our sights on Mystery Cave. Not a spectacular cave, but since neither of us have been caving in a while, it would be nice to go to any cave. There was a small passage in the lower portion of the cave that I wanted to check out to see if it was possible to get past it. It had a small opening, but lots of air blowing out of it. Even though it was way too small to climb through, I had never even checked to see what was inside the passage. We got our gear loaded up and hit the road by 3 p.m. We got to the cave in great time, since B likes to drive fast. We anchored from the usual tree, began to rappel into the cave. I went down first and got my gear together while B came down. I will refer to B many times. We've been caving together for many months now. He was injured in a caving accident a few years ago and was told he would never walk again. Through hard work and perseverance, he not only walks, but he can get around very well in caves. The trickier parts of a cave might slow him down a bit, but he can make it. He patiently works through an obstacle until he gets past it. As for the reference to the small opening in the cave, there is a saying amongst cavers: if it blows, it goes. Meaning, if the passage has a good flow of air, it is probably worth investigating. After we explored all of the usual passages, we climbed down to check out the hole. The hole is located deep in the cave, near the lowest part of the cave. It is on the side of a cave wall, about 3 feet from the floor. To look inside the hole, I had to kneel down to duck under an overhang of rock. I used my backpack mini mag light and held it inside the hole to see what I could see. I was excited by what I saw. The wall around the hole was around 3 to 5 inches thick. It led into a tight passage. The passage opened up a bit just inside the hole. It continued back about 10 or 12 feet into a small crawl space. After that, it seemed to really open up. Although how much, we couldn't tell. This could be a virgin passage. Obviously, no one has passed through this route, but there could be a way into the passage from the other side. To even get to the crawl space, we would have to enlarge the opening. Currently, it's about the size of my fist. Once we get past the opening, we would have a tight crawl back to where it opened up. It would take some work, but we thought we could do it. We sat down for a few minutes to rest and contemplate our plan of attack. While we sat there in the darkness, we could hear the wind howling from the other side of the passage. It was a low, eerie noise. We could also hear a low rumble from time to time. No big deal, though. The cave is in the vicinity of a highway, and the heavy trucks drive on it. We figured the rumble was the effect of the trucks resonating through the rocks. We determined that our best plan would be to haul a cordless drill into the cave to drill into the rock. Then we could take a bullpen and a small sledgehammer and break up the rock. It seemed pretty straightforward. We would widen the hole big enough to squeeze in and see what was on the other side. The efforts to haul all of the equipment down to the hole would be a pain, but we hoped it would be worth it. I named the passage Floyd's Tomb, after Floyd Collins. It seemed to look like the tight spot where Floyd spent his last miserable days on Earth.
Floyd Collins was a caver back in the early 1900s. He got stuck in a tight crawl space and was unable to free himself. It's an amazing story that is detailed in a book called Trapped, the story of Floyd Collins. I think that was the title. I don't recall the author. Calling our passage Floyd's Tomb was not only a tribute to Floyd, but a commentary of the size of the passage.
In retrospect, it's funny how simple I thought it was going to be. I figured a few hours of work and we would be in. Had I known how long it was going to take, I doubt I would have even begun the project. Had I known what I was going to experience in the cave, I never would have returned. We gathered up our gear and headed for the surface. Normally, I couldn't care less if I ever came back into this cave. There's nothing special about it, but now I was psyched about getting back and getting through. We hadn't even left the cave and we were planning our return trip.
The rest of the journal entry talked about the climb out of the cave, our dinner, and our trip back home.